Today I'm going to be telling you story after story of wilderness adventure gone wrong. Now, I've hiked thousands of miles over the years, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that setting foot on a hiking trail is like an instant death wish or anything like that. But I'm also not going to sugarcoat it, because on rare occasions, things do go incredibly wrong for people while they're out on their adventures. Like, incredibly wrong. You'll understand what I mean very shortly. And so with that said, I guess let's just dive right into the world of outdoor mysteries right now. We're going to do this together. So hit that subscribe button. Our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers before the end of the year. And if you could help us get there, I would appreciate it very much. And okay, are you ready? Buckle up, folks, because here we go. During the summer of 2023, a family of hikers parked their car at the Gold Creek campground in Colorado. Their plan was to go on a hike in the beautiful Gunnison National Forest, which they did. But as they were returning, the father noticed something strange off in the woods. From afar, it simply looked like your typical campsite. But as he walked closer and closer to the blue tent that was in the heart of the campsite, a wave of dread rushed over him. The campsite was covered with trash. This is disgusting, but human feces were piled up only feet away from the entrance of the tent. The smell of this site was just nothing short of foul. Who had pitched this tent? Why were they there? And what the hell had happened to him? I mean, these are the questions that were bouncing around the man's head as he contemplated what he should do next. Should he unzip the tent door and look at what was inside? It's a good question, and it was surely one on his mind. But as fate would have it, this man would never end up seeing the inside of the tent. And that's because, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something so disturbing that he immediately fled and called police. That blue tent would end up being open the following day, and its contents revealed a haunting story, even an enraging story, a story that would raise far more questions than it answered. And so with that said, buckle up, folks, because you're about to hear the incredibly disturbing story of the Vance family. I don't usually do this, but I feel like I should start this video with a warning. This is going to be a tough one to hear, folks. It's going to be a tough one for me to tell. It's an absolute heartbreaker, especially because it involves a child. And yet, at the same time, it is morbidly fascinating, and I do think that there's some things we can learn from it. So with that said, I'd like to invite you on a virtual trip right now to the beautiful state of Colorado. This trip is totally free, but you must hit the subscribe button to cover your admission, and this is especially true if you've watched a few of my videos now. If you're already subscribed, then I appreciate it very much, and if you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button and help us get to our very ambitious goal of 1 million subscribers. I'd now like to introduce you to two sisters, Christine Vance and Rebecca Vance, who often went by the name Becky. Christine was less than 2 years younger than Becky, and these two sisters were absolutely inseparable. Their bond was strong, and maybe that's because they felt like they were all each other had. Their family life was very rocky, torn apart before they even reached grade school. When the sisters were just 3 and 5 respectively, their mother left their father, and she took the girls with her, leaving Becky to grow up fast and take on the role of, you know, a protector for her little sister. As the family moved place to place with their mother, who was in the Air Force, by the way, we all know that can happen when people are in the military. As they moved place to place, Becky's sense of duty only grew stronger. She was Christine's constant, her guardian and guide through all the uncertainty and all the change. So the family's moving around so much, but eventually they would end up settling in the city of Colorado Springs. But shortly before they made this move, Christine and Becky's mother would remarry, and the young girls now found themselves with a stepsister whose name was Trevola. Trevola was 2 years younger than Christine, and as the girls got older and, went into high school, Christine began to grow very close with Trevola, often joining her as she got into various high school mischief, things like smoking weed or sneaking out of the house, things like that. Trevola and Christine grow closer, but Becky was actually quite distant with Trevola. And that's not to say that the two of them didn't get along or that they didn't like each other. It's just to say that Becky was private. She never fully opened up to Trevola. She would always maintain a sense of mystery, a wall that was between them. But with her mother, it was very different. Becky shared a super close bond with her mother, one that endured as all three girls, Becky, Christine, and Trevola, stayed under the same roof long after they graduated high school. They grew up in a home that, for a time at least, seemed to be united, where the Vance sisters accepted their stepfather and began to settle into a new family dynamic. It seemed like they were on track to finally leave their turbulent past behind and build a life that was steady. But then, in 2007, everything changed in their worlds, and not for the better. Things are about to get quite sad, to be honest, and so before we get there, I'd like to just pause, take a deep breath, and lighten the mood for just a moment and tell you about Drink Element. Drink Element is the sponsor of this video. They are the best electrolyte drink mix company out there. You might be able to tell by my voice and my demeanor right now. I'm a little sick. I'm feeling better. I'm kind of on the upswing, but I've been sick the past few days, and I gotta say, having elements to replace my electrolytes and to keep me hydrated has been a total godsend. Because, it's easy to get dehydrated when you're sick. I had a little bit of a fever, I was sweating, and so I was at risk of being dehydrated, and of course Element was helping so much with that. And the thing you gotta understand about Element is that they don't have sugar and other crap like pretty much all of the other electrolyte drink mix companies do. Because if you're sick, or if you're out hiking on the trail or shoveling snow in your driveway, just doing anything that makes you sweat, you don't need to be sucking down a bunch of sugar. That just doesn't make any sense. Element doesn't have that sugar. What they do have though is an amazing taste. I mean, I'm telling you, I have been just pounding citrus salts and grapefruit salt, my two favorite flavors, over these past few days. Those are the two that I personally would recommend you start with, but they have so many other awesome flavors as well. In fact, what you can actually do is go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or just click the link at the top of the description and then go make a purchase through that link of citrus or grapefruit or whatever flavor sounds best to you. And when you do that through my link, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost, which means you're gonna get to try all of their amazing flavors. So you're gonna just find out for sure which ones are your favorites. One more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Element, thank you for helping me feel a little better over this sickness, and thank you for sponsoring my content, continuing to sponsor my content. Element's awesome. And now let's get back to the video. Becky and Christine's mother would tragically pass away in 2007 from cancer. And this event straight up just struck the family like a thunderbolt. For Becky, who'd always been known as reserved and withdrawn, this loss was earth-shattering. She retreated even further into herself, a silence settling over her that seemed to speak volumes. The one person who'd anchored her was now gone, leaving her adrift and struggling to find her way in a world that suddenly felt far too empty. Trevola, again, their stepsister, was quoted in an Outside magazine article saying, "Becky has always been a recluse, always kept to herself, never really liked to be around people. Our mom and her were really close, and when she passed away, it took a huge toll on Becky. I think she became a little more of a recluse, and when you're by yourself for so many years and don't have many friends or anything, your thoughts can get to you." The year after her mom died, Becky would become pregnant. And the father was a man named Eric, and the two had met each other while working at Atmel, which is a computer chip manufacturing plant where Christine also worked, by the way. At the time of Becky's pregnancy, the Vance sisters were still living at home with their stepfather and their stepsister. Becky's relationship with Eric, and her pregnancy for that matter, is difficult to describe. When Becky found out that she was unexpectedly pregnant with Eric's child, things easily could have spiraled into chaos. I mean, we've all seen this happen before. A surprise pregnancy outside of a marriage often leads to tension, arguments, and even legal battles over custody or child support money. But that didn't happen here. There was no explosive breakup. There was no harsh words or dramatic fights, but something still felt off. Becky and Eric's relationship wasn't hostile, but at the same time, it was just weird. I just can't really think of another way to describe it. And take this as an example. So Becky didn't tell Eric when their baby was born. He wasn't at the hospital for the birth of his child. In fact, the only reason he found out his child had been born was because a friend of his texted him to congratulate him. Becky also neglected to put Eric's name down as the father on the baby's birth certificate. Isn't that kind of strange? Becky never took him to court to try to get money or anything like that, but these actions were very strange, and she did also tell Eric that she didn't want to co-parent their new baby, which was a boy that she named Talon, by the way, again, without consulting Eric. And yet, despite all of these bizarre actions, Becky and Eric remained on pretty good terms. She was nice to him, but again, just like she was with her stepsister, she was just kind of distant. And then, to add even more weirdness to this situation, Becky struck up an unlikely relationship with Eric's mother, who was named Marilyn. Becky began dropping off Talon at the home where Eric and Marilyn lived, usually when she was on her way to work. As time went on, these visits became more regular, and Marilyn developed a very close relationship with her growing grandson. It's at this point that, for the second time in their lives, things seemed to kind of stabilize for the Vance sisters. But that was until late 2019, when their stepfather tragically passed away. And then, only a few short months later, COVID began spreading around the world. We all remember what this time was like. We all remember the lockdowns, the blurred lines between work and home life, the uncertainty of employment, and we remember kids being pulled out of school and placed into an impossible remote learning environment. The government's response to the COVID pandemic greatly affected the lives of the Vance sisters. Just like everyone else, they were now spending more time online on the internet than ever before, and Becky in particular began to go down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. All right, I'm going to try to make this as non-controversial as I can. If you read many of the articles about this particular story, they kind of make Becky out to be your classic conspiracy theory nut job, but I'm going to try to be a little bit more careful with the way that I describe her online habits, because I do think that many of us will agree that during the COVID pandemic, there were some things that were called conspiracy theories that actually turned out to be at least partially based in truth, if not entirely true. Again, I don't want to turn this into a video about conspiracy theories. All I'm saying is that a lot of reasonable people were asking a lot of good questions, and I totally acknowledge that. But at the same time, there was a fringe minority of people who took these conspiracy theories way too far and were essentially preying on the fear that the government's response to COVID had caused. And unfortunately, this is the corner of the internet that Becky got wrapped up in. After COVID, Becky began spending way more time online, and I find her increase in internet activity kind of ironic, because we all know, at least on some level, that spending a ton of time on social media isn't really the best thing. The reason I say that it's a bit ironic is because of the way that Becky handled her son Talon's privileges with the internet. Becky herself was spending a lot of time on social media, but she was firm about keeping Talon away from it. She didn't allow him to have any accounts, he didn't have a cell phone, and she tightly controlled his internet access. And while there's nothing wrong with caution when it comes to social media and young kids, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, Becky's strictness stands out against some of her other parenting choices. By early 2021, when schools in Colorado Springs finally reopened for in-person learning, Becky made a surprising choice. Instead of sending Talon back to school, she decided to keep him isolated at home, continuing with remote learning, even as life around them was beginning to open back up. Keeping Talon home from school shut down one of his very few chances at social interaction, and sadly, he really didn't have many others. Talon's father, Eric, once suggested signing Talon up for the local soccer team, but Becky dismissed this idea, showing little interest in Talon joining any activities outside the house. Once in a while, he would play with the neighbors' kids, but those moments were very rare, leaving Talon with an isolated, solitary life for such a young boy. His only consistent social outlet was online gaming, where he forged some quiet friendships with other gamers that only knew him by his screen name. Meanwhile, Becky grew more and more paranoid, and eventually she made the surprising decision to just quit her job. This left her with even more time on her hands to sit on the internet and dive deeper into the world of conspiracy theories. And to be clear here, I keep feeling the need to clarify this. I'm not talking conspiracies like, oh, maybe the virus was actually human-made. I'm not talking those theories that a lot of people were talking about at the time. I'm talking about conspiracy theories that were full on, like, the world is coming to an end, society is going to collapse, they're trying to put microchips inside of us. I'm talking about those kinds of conspiracies. But with that said, 99% of the time, even the truest believers of these kinds of conspiracy theories don't actually take like drastic measures in response. Sure, they might prep a bit, they might stock up on supplies and keep themselves informed, but it's not like most of them quit their job and then move out into the wilderness with no connection to the outside world. Those are obviously very extreme actions. But for Becky, it turns out that that's what she believed she needed to do in order to save her life and the lives of her family. Towards the end of 2021, right at the height of the division over masks and big pharma and all the other COVID stuff, Christine Vance sent a text to her stepsister Trevella that said this, quote, "You would never guess what Becky wants to do. She wants to live off the grid." I'm not sure how seriously Christine took this idea at first, but eventually this chilling reality set in for her. Becky was dead serious. She meant business. And she wanted Christine and her son Talon to come with her. Initially, Christine did not want anything to do with this. She did not want to join Becky. She thought the idea was insane, and she worried that their lack of outdoor experience would lead to certain disaster. However, Becky played the long game, and over the course of a few months, Christine did a full 180 on this idea. Christine would text Trevella very often, venting about the struggles that weighed on her. Christine was unhappy with her body, she was wrestling with self-doubt, and she was also feeling the toll of age pressing down on her as she hit 40. Depression seemed to cloud her daily life, and it's likely that this feeling of despair played a role in her eventual decision to embrace Becky's radical plan to live off the grid. For Christine, leaving it all behind must have seemed like a chance to kind of start fresh, a way to escape the spiral that she felt trapped in. By the summer of 2022, Christine's outlook had taken a very dark turn, mirroring many of the conspiracy theories Becky had come to believe. When Christine told Trevella that herself, Becky, and Talon would be leaving to live off the grid, Christine refused to tell Trevola where they were gonna go. Trevola was immediately concerned, and she urged Christine to reconsider, but unfortunately these objections fell on deaf ears. Christine and Becky's decision was made, and no amount of reasoning could seem to shake them from their plans. Desperate, Trevola even tried to take action on her own to prevent them from doing this. Trevola made an offer to Christine and Becky. So Trevola and her husband owned this undeveloped plot of land up in the mountains west of Colorado Springs, and she said that the Vance sisters and Talon could go live on this plot of land. There was a camper parked on the property, which would provide them with some comfort and safety. You know, they could go live there, and they could just drop this idea of going somewhere else, somewhere even more remote, with no shelter available. Becky did not want to hear it. To her, this location wasn't even close to remote enough. I mean, it had road access after all. It had a mailing address. In Becky's mind, safety meant going to a place so remote, so out of touch with society, that not even her close relatives would be able to find her. Weeks would go by, and the Vance sisters made preparations to head off into the wilderness. They got rid of the food that was in their fridge that was, gonna expire. They made plans to give their cat away. Christine even tried to gift Trevola her car. And at some point, Talon, the son, who is now 13 years old, was informed of their plans because he too started to prepare for his departure. At Becky's insistence, Talon began learning various bushcraft skills, things like tying knots or building lean-tos and trying to identify edible plants, things like that. And Talon also began saying his goodbyes, which is very sad. His goodbyes both to his online video game friends and to the family cat. Talon wrote over 20 pages in his journal, quoting his online friends' responses to his planned departure. One user wrote, quote, "No, come back." Another wrote, "Hi, if you see this, I'm crying." And perhaps the saddest response Talon recorded, quote, "Roblox is no fun anymore. It always makes me lose my best friends." But as if that wasn't sad enough, Talon also journaled about his cat, which was named Oreo. He wrote, quote, "Oreo always plopped on our laps when we were on the couch. On the 29th of July, Oreo plopped between me and mommy as we were practicing ropes and knots. During online school, I would work on the couch a lot of the time. Because of that, Oreo would plop on me. On the 29th of July, Oreo plopped on me for the last time." A few days after this journal entry, Becky, Christine, and Talon stopped by the house where Eric and Talon's grandmother, Marilyn, lived. Christine waited by the car as Becky greeted Marilyn with Talon in tow. Becky gave her a small box filled with bits and pieces of Talon's life. Things like school portrait photos, old t-shirts, and other items that she had gathered from Talon's childhood. She then told Marilyn 2 big lies. Becky told her that they were no longer safe in Colorado Springs and that they would be moving to West Virginia to be close to Becky's biological father. Marilyn's follow-up questions were met with vague, unhelpful answers, and then Becky leaned in and she told Marilyn not to ask Talon about this because he didn't know yet, which was a lie. He did know. Everybody said their goodbyes, and Marilyn was left completely perplexed as the Vance sisters and Talon drove away. Becky had never once expressed any desire to go see her biological dad, and yet now they were just gonna uproot their life and move to go be near him. It didn't make sense, and Marilyn's instincts told her that there was more to this story. But as the car disappeared down the road, she didn't have a choice. She was left completely powerless. And as fate would have it, she would never see the Vance sisters or her grandson ever again. The group drove away, leaving Colorado Springs behind, venturing deep into the rugged and unforgiving Rocky Mountains. For over 3 hours, they navigated a maze of winding roads, each turn pulling them further away from civilization. The pavement eventually gave way to dirt and gravel as they entered the remote wilderness of Gunnison National Forest, following the desolate path of Forest Service Road 771. The road climbed steadily, the air growing thinner with every mile, until they found themselves nearly 10,000 feet, or around 3,000 meters, above sea level. And at the very end of this lonely, forgotten road, they reached a place called Gold Creek Campground. This would be the place that they chose to disappear from the world. Gold Creek Campground is run by the United States Forest Service, and it consists of a few designated campsites, a pit toilet, and pretty much nothing else. It doesn't even have a permanent employee or a caretaker. The Vance sisters and Talon claimed one of the established sites, and they then spent the next few days scouting the wilderness surrounding the campground, searching for a more secluded and permanent spot. They eventually built a campsite that was about 150 to 200 yards east of Gold Creek Campground, and it was hidden in some dense forest with a stream and a pond nearby. It was here that the family settled in, setting up their $80 Walmart tent, along with a tarp and a few other basic pieces of camping gear. They also built a small lean-to, and this was going to be their makeshift home for what they believed to be a self-reliant life off the grid. But noticeably absent from their gear were sleeping pads. Instead of using sleeping pads, they just put down a few blankets underneath them, which is, by the way, a glaring sign that the Vance family was not going to be prepared for the cold weather that would await them in just a few short weeks. Not only would it be incredibly uncomfortable to sleep on the ground without a pad, but it would also be very, very cold. You see, sleeping pads provide essential insulation to keep you warm during chilly nights spent outside. Other choices in their gear raises even more questions. For instance, the family brought along a few life straws to help filter their water and to protect them against giardia and other parasites. And this would have been a wise choice for a normal short summer camping trip, but life straws lose their ability to filter if they freeze. Even worse is that if the filters do freeze, my backpacking viewers know this, they give no indication that they're no longer safe to use. And this meant that the family could unknowingly consume contaminated water, which was a potentially deadly mistake. They did have sleeping bags, but they weren't rated for winter temperatures. Again, they're at 10,000 feet in the Colorado mountains. They're gonna need some warm bags. They didn't have any big knives, and they didn't have any guns. If something were to go wrong for them, they would be all alone in the wilderness with no cell service to call for help and nobody to turn to. It was clear that the Vance family were setting themselves up for failure, and the scariest part is that they didn't even know it. Despite their poorly chosen gear, the family did manage to scrape by for the first couple months. They made occasional trips into the nearby town of Gunnison to restock supplies, which was an experience that Talon described in detail in his journal. His entries reveal a boy caught in this emotional tug of war, we'll say. On one side, he felt the pressure to support his mother and his aunt, wanting to live up to their expectations and share in their vision of this off-grid lifestyle. But on the other hand, it's clear that Talon was deeply unhappy with the situation that he was trapped in. His words paint a picture of a child trying to balance loyalty with his own growing discontent, a heartbreaking glimpse into the cracks forming within the Vance family's ill-fated journey. Talon wrote about how Christine had taken him to the fast food joint Arby's. He wrote, quote, "I also had a mini breakdown at Arby's because nothing feels the same anymore." And then he put like a frowny face. "During my breakdown, she took us to Safeway and let me pick out candy of my choice. I was so sad that nothing really sounded appealing to me anymore. So I picked out chocolate for mommy mostly, and then auntie suggested fruit snacks for me, so I just said okay. In October, the family made another trip into the town of Gunnison, and Becky called her father with a strange request. She asked him to immediately wire her $500, which was a request that he complied with. The Vances bought a camping stove, some food, some matches, toilet paper, and a few other items, and then they just returned to the wilderness. The brief phone call that Becky had made to her father would go on to be the last time that anybody heard from the Vances. A month later, a Forest Service ranger was on a rare patrol of Forest Road 771 when he noticed the Vance's car parked off to the side. To this ranger, the car seemed like it had been abandoned, and so he briefly searched the area to try to locate the owner, and this proved unsuccessful, obviously, and then the police ran the license plates, and they actually tried to call Becky and Christine, but their numbers had both been shut down. Marilyn, again, Talon's grandmother, had also been consistently trying to reach out to the Vance sisters, wondering when they would be returning from West Virginia, but she too was never able to make contact. The Vance's car was soon towed out of the wilderness just as winter was finally settling in. Nobody knew what had happened to the Vance family until the following July, when a chilling discovery brought the entire story to light. It was on July 9th, 2023, that the father I mentioned at the very start of this video stumbled upon the horror that was the Vance campsite. Before this hiker could even open the tent, his eyes locked in on the shocking sight of Talon's mummified body curled into the fetal position on the ground. Overcome with dread, this hiker didn't dare venture any further. Instead, he simply fled the scene and immediately reported it to the authorities. The very next morning, a team of police officers, search and rescue personnel, and a coroner arrived at the remote campsite. Talon's body lay approximately 13 feet in front of this weathered blue tent that they had been sleeping in, a grim prelude to what awaited inside of this tent. When they unzipped the tent, they were met with a terrible sight. They found the mummified remains of both Becky and Christine. Becky lay partially exposed, kind of on the top of her sleeping bag, while Christine's body was entirely covered by her bag, even her face, as if she was like seeking shelter from the inevitable. This scene was one of utter despair. There was trash piled up all around the campsite, and there was also a massive pile of human waste, just a few feet outside of the tent. Among the items recovered was Christine's driver's license, which helped confirm the identities, and also Talon's heartbreaking journal. Reportedly, this journal still smelled like campfire smoke. Autopsy results were released the following month, and they were met with a wave of media attention. The official cause of the deaths was listed as malnutrition and hypothermia. It's speculated that during the month of December 2022, Talon died first, and then the Vance sisters placed his body outside the tent. Becky likely died next, after which Christine zipped herself inside her sleeping bag and just laid there until she too met her inevitable death. As this terrible story went viral, the world wanted to know the answer to one simple question. That is, why didn't the family abandon their plans once they realized they wouldn't survive the winter? It's not like they just died suddenly, right? It was very apparent that they suffered slow, drawn-out deaths. So how come they didn't seek help before it was too late? Now, any attempt to answer this question is just pure speculation. We don't really know. Maybe they tried to evacuate at some point, but then they noticed that their car had been towed and they felt like there was no other option, or they were just so famished that they were just delirious and they didn't even consider escaping. Or maybe the sisters were so stubborn and scared of the world that they just accepted their death and dragged Talon along as well. Folks, we're never going to know exactly what happened in those woods outside of Gold Creek Campground. There's really just no way to know. I really hope that none of you ever go into the wilderness as dangerously unprepared as the Vance family was. And I also hope that all of you please keep them in your hearts, as well as all of their surviving friends and family members. Over the course of just a few short days in 2021, every single person in the US learned who this woman was. And then, a few weeks later, every single person in the US learned that she had been found dead. Of course, you already know this story. You remember it because the story of Gabby Petito was probably the most viral missing person / murder case since the invention of the internet, possibly in United States history. It was everywhere. It received tons of coverage on the news and on social media, and yet, beyond all the headlines and the heartbreak, there's a deeper, dare I say, darker story that very few people seem to be talking about. In this video, I'm going to be uncovering the truth about Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, and just a warning, I don't think that many of you are gonna like it. In order to get to this truth, we need to start right here in the town of Moab, Utah. This is where, on August 12th, 2021, Gabby Petito and her fiance Brian Laundrie were pulled over by the police, and Gabby said this to the officer.
Just quit my job to travel across the country, and I'm trying to start a blog. I have a blog and stuff, so I've been building my website, so I've just been really stressed, and he doesn't really believe that I could do any of it, so that's kind of been like a, I don't know, he's like down there, I don't know, we've just been fighting all morning, and...
Now, I kind of cherry-picked that clip there, sorry about that. There's a lot more context to this body cam footage, and we are going to be coming back to it shortly to explain more, but I think the words that you just heard Gabby say mark the true start of our story. Those words make it clear that Gabby Petito wanted to be an influencer. And man, do I hate the word influencer. I mean, every influencer literally talks about how they hate the word influencer, but at the same time, that's pretty much what my job is. That's right. I have the gall to say that I am an influencer on camera. Anyways, before I tell you about how Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie ended up on that police body cam in the first place, I am legally obligated to do the most influencer thing possible, which is to tell you to smash that subscribe button right now. God, smash it as hard as you can in order to try and reach peak influencer, you know, all the way up here. I'm trying to get this channel to 1 million subscribers, so any help would be much appreciated. Okay, so Gabby Petito was born on March 19th, 1999 in Blue Point, New York, which is a small community on the longest island in the United States, aka Long Island. I don't know if that's true. I just made that up. But anyways, during her upbringing, she became known for her adventurous spirit, her creativity, and for her positive attitude. Gabby dreamed of exploring the world, and thus it's no surprise that she eventually became captivated by this idea of van life. The van life dream. This was something she became fixated on, but all she needed was someone to go with her. Now, do you remember this dude right here? Chances are you probably hate his guts because pretty much everyone hates his guts after what happened here. But this is Brian Laundrie, obviously. And he also grew up on Long Island, and he also shared Gabby Petito's interest in travel and outdoor adventures. The two of them met while they were in school, and they began dating in high school, and then after they graduated, they would end up moving together down to Florida along with Brian's parents. They both posted a lot of content on Instagram, you know, things like highlighting their road trips and their hikes, something I absolutely hate, and highlighting their mutual love for the outdoors and nature. They got engaged in 2020, and at this time, it appeared that Gabby and Brian were living the absolute dream. Let's be honest here. Their relationship seemed perfect, or at least it did, according to what they posted on social media. By late 2020, the classic van life dream had been firmly planted in the minds of Gabby and Brian. And honestly, this makes total sense. Now, living in a van has always been something that people do, but I feel like back in the day, years ago, it used to be kind of a negative thing, like, oh, that guy lives in a van down by the river, stay away from him. But by 2020, things had obviously changed. A lot more people were doing van life. People, from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, people with all different reasons for doing it. Van life was more popular than ever before. And speaking of the popularity of van life, there's a number of reasons that by 2020, it was just exploding in popularity. Some people think it's because of the COVID pandemic, more people spending time inside and then realizing they want to get away from it all. I don't know. Some people say the popularity was because of the rising prices of housing or just, the overall cost of living, life just being more expensive. And I'm sure that both those reasons played a role in the popularity of van life. But I think that its popularity can mostly be attributed to one thing, and that is social media. Social media is how most people, myself included, and Brian and Gabby, of course, it's how most people find out about van life in the first place. And it's also, by the way, where people see van life romanticized to death. Van life seems super appealing at first. I mean, you get to travel the country, you get to see all these amazing sights, you get to have all this freedom. But what you don't realize is that it also means that you're gonna be in the woods in the middle of winter. It means that instead of paying thousands of dollars in rent, you're gonna be paying thousands of dollars in gas and in vehicle repairs. It means you're going to be spending days, weeks, maybe even months and longer away from home and away from your friends and your family. I'm not going to lie to you guys, and a lot of you probably already knew this, but there's been times in my life where I've drank the van life Kool-Aid and almost considered doing it myself. However, I've spent enough time camping, adventuring, and yes, in the woods to know how difficult and even scary full-time van life can be. So even though I was just totally ripping on the concept of van life there, I do genuinely understand why people do it. And I'm also happy to acknowledge that there's tons of people who absolutely love it. They do it successfully, and it brings a lot of fulfillment to their life. And I will say, despite how much van life is romanticized on the internet, on paper, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie seemed like they would be the perfect couple to pursue the classic van life dream. In December of 2020, Gabby Petito, she took a step towards doing just that. She bought a Ford Transit Connect van, and with big dreams and, of course, a glue gun, she and Brian got to work transforming their van into the perfect tiny mobile home. Gabby and Brian had very bold and exciting, frankly, plans. They were planning a 4-month cross-country adventure. However, we need to be honest about this. A trip like that requires two things. It requires comfort, hence the van, and it requires cash. And as the couple found out, comfort doesn't really come cheap. Gabby was laser focused on funding the couple's van life dream. Throughout the winter, the spring, and the early summer of 2021, she absolutely hustled, folks. She was juggling multiple jobs to try and make this van life dream happen. And at the same time, Brian Laundrie was slinging smoothies at a juice bar because apparently, a road trip budget doesn't just build itself. By July 2nd, 2021, the couple had finally saved up enough money to pack up the van and hit the road, leaving Blue Point, New York in the rearview mirror. They headed west, chasing sunsets and Instagram-worthy views. It seemed like the start of an epic adventure. But what began as a summer dream was obviously, as we all know, about to spiral into a nightmare that the entire world would soon know about. All throughout the time leading up to their departure, Gabby's social media posts continued. I'm talking photos of her and Brian hiking on the Appalachian Trail. Photo after photo of their adventures, all putting out positivity and good vibes. Just like it always had, Gabby and Brian's social media portrayed a happy, stable couple that was having the time of their lives. To the outside world, their relationship looked perfect. But offline, it was, well, anything but. To the people that were close to Gabby and Brian, something between them just seemed off. It was almost as though the more that Gabby and Brian tried to kind of show off their amazing life on Instagram, the more obvious that the cracks in their relationship became. One of Gabby's friends was quoted saying, "Honestly, it seemed like a jealousy problem," which I understood because you look at Brian and then you look at Gabby and you're like, Gabby, you could have anyone in this entire world. He, referring to Brian again, did have jealousy issues, and that was apparent. I mean, that you could see right through it when after you hang out with them just a few times. So at first, this friend down in Florida didn't notice any like major obvious red flags, but clearly she felt like Brian Laundrie had some issues, to put it mildly. But then, on a random Friday night in 2020, this very same friend noticed an obvious moment of abuse that Gabby suffered at Brian's hands. Gabby and this friend wanted to go out to a bar on this particular Friday night. Go out, have some fun, have a few drinks. Nothing crazy, nothing out of the ordinary. But the jealous and controlling Brian did not want this to happen under any circumstance. He tried to convince Gabby at first not to go out, but that didn't work. And so instead, he did what any reasonable boyfriend would do. Obviously, he stole her ID, because without that ID, Gabby wouldn't be able to get into any bars and she would be forced to stay at home with Brian. Totally reasonable, right? Very, very normal. Obviously, sarcasm, but you knew that. That's super sketchy, like a clear sign of abuse. And Gabby's friend was quoted saying, he's, again referring to Brian, he's got these jealousy issues and he struggles from what Gabby called these episodes, where he would hear things and hear voices and then he wouldn't sleep. Gabby had to stay at my house a bunch of times because she just needed a breather and didn't want to go home to him. When Gabby confronted Brian about stealing her ID, she was so enraged that she apparently slapped him in the face. Brian, you know, being the outstanding guy he was, responded physically himself, pushing Gabby, but apparently the incident ended there. Nobody actually witnessed this fight, and the police were never called. There was no, domestic issue on record. However, that would not be the case when the almost exact same thing happened about a year later on August 12th, 2021, while Gabby and Brian were over a month into their van life dream. So when Gabby and Brian first hit the road, they did what anyone from the East Coast would do when they start a trip like this. They drove straight west, straight for the Rocky Mountains. They spent a few days in Colorado before crossing the state line into actually the very same state that I'm sitting in right now, which of course would be the great state of Utah, the Beehive State, baby. It's in this very state that the plot of this Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie story really begins to thicken. On August 12th, 2021, somebody in Moab, Utah called 911 to report a domestic dispute that they had witnessed in public. Allegedly, Brian and Gabby got into a verbal altercation, which quickly turned physical when Brian slapped Gabby on the sidewalk. The couple continued to argue after this, and a few more slaps and punches were exchanged before Brian, again, allegedly tried to drive off in the couple's van without Gabby. He tried to leave her behind. This may have been his intention initially, but it didn't end up happening. Ultimately, the two of them would end up back inside of the van, at which point Brian sped out of town towards Arches National Park. Moab police responded very quickly, and they actually followed Brian for a few minutes, witnessing him going way too fast and driving erratically, before they finally pulled the van over right in front of the entrance gate for Arches National Park.
Sorry, officer.
You want to place your vehicle into park and go ahead and turn it off for me?
Yeah.
Gabby is clearly in distress in this body cam footage, and almost immediately she starts apologizing and taking the blame for this altercation. Now, I'm no expert on domestic abuse and disputes like that. I'm not going to pretend that I am, but from what little I do understand, this is a classic sign of someone who is suffering from abuse. You know, they're defending and sticking up for the very person who is actually harming them. That's very clearly what Gabby was doing, and it's very sad and very hard to watch. But Brian, on the other hand, well, in this footage, he appears cool, calm, and collected, if anything, just maybe a little bit embarrassed. Brian had visible scratches on his body, which the officers, of course, would ask him about. Gabby would go on to tell the officers that she had quit her job and she was stressed out about trying to make a living doing social media full time. This is yet another example of the role that content creation and, again, social media played in Gabby's van life dream. And again, going back to the things that they would post, Brian appeared to be happy in all of the couple's Instagram photos, but as we find out from this body cam footage, apparently behind the scenes, he actually wasn't supportive of Gabby's dream to become an influencer. The now infamous Moab police stop ended with no arrests and no charges, which is a decision that would haunt this story forever. A lot of people make a very compelling argument that this was a missed chance for the police to intervene and to possibly prevent the unspeakable tragedy that loomed ahead. But of course, hindsight is 2020. In fact, in an almost surreal twist of reality, the officers concluded that Gabby, not Brian, but Gabby, was the aggressor here, and they actually labeled Brian the victim of domestic assault. That means that if anyone had been cuffed away that day, it would have been Gabby Petito. This baffling outcome came despite those chilling 911 calls which claimed that Brian had physically attacked Gabby. As this story developed and as the body cam footage became public, the fallout for the Moab Police Department was swift and relentless as public outrage boiled over in late 2021. In fact, to this day, Moab Police's handling of this stop of this case remains a lightning rod for criticism, with courtroom debates picking apart their decisions piece by piece. There's still legal stuff going on with this to this day. It's a grim, you could say, reminder of just how much was at stake during that fateful traffic stop. But of course, nobody really knew that at the time. Even if Gabby had been arrested, as wrong as that might sound, that still might have been enough to prevent the events that we're about to get into. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. And Gabby and Brian were simply just separated for the night. Gabby remained in the van, and Brian was actually given a free hotel room. And then the next morning, the couple reconvened. They came back together, and they slowly began making their way north through Utah, heading for Salt Lake City. On August 17th, Brian Laundrie flew from Salt Lake City back to his parents' home in Florida, while Gabby hunkered down inside of a hotel room. And just as a side note, when I was first researching for this video, I was driving back from the airport listening to podcasts about this case, and I actually got stuck in traffic right next to the exact hotel that she was staying in, which was a weird coincidence. But anyways, on August 19th, well, that would be a day that would be pretty significant in this story, because that's the day that Gabby posted this video on the couple's brand new YouTube channel. The video shows them traveling around in the van, laughing, smiling, and also being incredibly affectionate towards each other. If you were to take this video at face value, you would never guess in a million years that only a week before the video was uploaded, the cops had been called on the couple for domestic assault. Like, the contrast there is just absolutely insane. On August 24th, Brian returned to Salt Lake City. Gabby left that hotel room that I drove by, and the couple hit the road, heading further north, this time aiming for the Jackson, Wyoming area and Grand Teton National Park. The following day, Gabby spoke with her mother on the phone, and she posted this photo on her Instagram. It shows her posing on the sidewalk, apparently taken in Ogden, Utah, smiling, laughing, and just looking as happy as could be. Folks, this would be the last thing that Gabby Petito ever posted on social media. On August 27th, Gabby and Brian were witnessed arguing amongst themselves and with the staff of a Jackson, Wyoming restaurant. Brian was apparently just pissed off, heated, hostile, while Gabby was kind of apologizing for this behavior, and she was clearly very emotionally distraught. Eventually, they left the restaurant, and then they drove over to a nearby grocery store where they were captured on security footage. At 2:56 p.m., the footage showed them driving away from the store in their white van in the direction of the Bridger Teton National Forest. This footage would prove to be the last time that Gabby Petito was ever seen alive. Just days later, Brian Laundrie showed up at his parents' house in Florida, driving the van that him and Gabby had shared on their cross-country adventure, but something was disturbingly wrong, and that was the fact that Gabby wasn't with him. Her absence was a giant red flag, obviously, and while her family hadn't yet reported her missing, they were starting to become very worried by this point. They had received a few text messages in the last few days from Gabby, but something about these texts felt off, almost as if they weren't actually written by her. And then those messages just stopped altogether. And so finally, on September 11th, 2021, after 2 agonizing weeks of silence, Gabby Petito's family reported her missing. And what happened next is almost unprecedented in American history. Within just a few short days, Gabby wasn't just a missing person, she was the most talked about name in the entirety of the United States. Her face was inescapable as the entire nation watched the unfolding tragedy, unable to look away. I mean, Gabby's story was everywhere. It was on every news channel, every social media feed. Everyone was talking about Gabby Petito. And while she might have been the most famous person, Brian Laundrie quickly became the most infamous, even you could say the most hated person in all of the United States. Gabby was missing, and Brian was the obvious suspect from the very beginning. I mean, he was the last person to see Gabby, after all. And then, as more damning information about their relationship began to emerge, including that body cam footage from the Moab incident, millions of fingers, both literal and virtual, became aimed squarely at Brian Laundrie. Accusations against him flooded both of their social media accounts, with strangers demanding answers, justice, and even retribution for Brian. Protesters gathered outside of Brian's parents' home in Florida, chanting, screaming, and turning the Laundrie's quiet suburban streets into something of a battleground. The pressure on Brian and his family was mounting. Everybody wanted them to talk to the police, to address the media, and to tell the world what the hell had happened to Gabby Petito. But Brian and his family stayed silent. And then Brian too disappeared. Brian left his parents' house on September 13th to go hiking at Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park. By September 17th, he hadn't returned, and thus he was reported missing by his parents. In fact, his parents even located his car at that same park, and they brought it home with them so it wouldn't get towed, which is a little strange because, he could have still been out there. He hadn't been found yet. Like, why would they bring his car home? Like, what if he made his way back to the car and then he was like, oh no, I don't have a car. I don't know. Just very weird behavior by his parents, but it's just a weird situation. And something that is kind of unique in this case is that for just a few short days there, both Brian and Gabby were officially listed as missing persons. But of course, that streak would come crashing to an end on September 19th. The authorities had reason to believe that Gabby and Brian had been staying at the Spread Creek dispersed camping area just outside of Jackson, Wyoming. And with this information, they announced to the public that anyone who had seen them in that area or just been in that area should come forward to share their story. When Kyle and Jen Bethune heard this announcement, they were left completely shocked. The Bethunes had been at Spread Creek around the same time that Gabby and Brian were there, and they actually remembered passing a white van with Florida plates. They remembered seeing the license plates. The Bethunes were also a van life couple who were filming social media content, and so when they heard this announcement, they began to review the footage that they had taken while they were out there, and lo and behold, there it was. Gabby and Brian's white van parked at a campsite, captured on their camera. This was a huge, but also very tragic break in the case, because once the authorities searched the campsite where their van had been captured on camera, well, that's when they found Gabby's body. She had been killed by, quote, blunt force injuries to the head and neck with manual strangulation. The internet exploded with grief and anger when it was announced that Gabby had been murdered. At this point, everybody, including the FBI, was convinced basically that Brian was responsible for her death, but at this point he was still nowhere to be found. And that's not to say they weren't searching, of course. The search for him was incredibly intense, and there were all sorts of rumors about where he was hiding. In fact, one of the popular rumors was that Brian was actually hiding out on the Appalachian Trail. And because back then my YouTube channel was mostly focused on the AT and my experiences through hiking and stuff, I actually got an email from a major news network asking if I would be interested in coming on live TV and talking about this Appalachian Trail theory, which was very strange because I don't know, I didn't do it, obviously. So the search for Brian continued, and then, as fate would have it, nearly exactly, strangely enough, a month after Gabby's body was found, police recovered Brian's remains, not on the Appalachian Trail, of course, but rather in Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, obviously, because that was the last place that he had been known to visit. That's where they found his car, and after a month, that's where they found him. Brian had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, which basically, well, not basically, it 100% ensured that he would never actually face any true justice for his evil actions. Near Brian's body was a notebook, which contained a bizarre written confession to Gabby's murder. Brian claimed that Gabby had suffered severe injuries and hypothermia while they were hiking together, and Brian had killed her to put her out of her misery. Essentially, Brian's confession claimed that it was a mercy killing. Now, we're obviously never going to know for sure if that's true or false, but most experts agree that this journal entry was almost certainly a last-ditch effort to kind of clear his name. Brian Laundrie exhibited every red flag in the book when it comes to being a narcissistic abuser, literally right down to his last moments on Earth with the things he wrote in that journal, with him trying to deflect the blame, trying to clear his name. I mean, let's be honest, I could spend the rest of this video ripping on Brian, talking about how evil he is, but I think we already know that. We already know how evil he is. And those evil intentions, don't get me wrong, they are worth talking about, but there's plenty of people who have already covered that, and I also have a lot in this video. And so instead, I want to talk about a few things that haven't been talked about quite as much in relation to this case, at least not by the mainstream media. Now, I'm not going to lie here. Some of you might not like what I have to say next. But with that said, we're a few years removed from this case. And so I think this is as good a time as ever to reflect on it. The story of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie wasn't just a headline. It was a cultural phenomenon. I'm talking one of, if not the biggest viral missing person and murder case in American history. Considering that over 500,000 people vanish in the United States every single year, the virality of this case raises a very compelling question. And that question is, why? Why this case? What made this particular tragedy resonate so deeply that it overshadowed almost every single other missing person and murder case? Just as an example of what I'm talking about here, the day after Gabby and Brian were pulled over in Moab, Utah, two campers, Kylan Schultz and Crystal Turner, were both murdered just outside of that very same town, Moab. And yet, they didn't receive the same headlines and press as Gabby and Brian did. It was such a similar situation in literally the exact same place at the exact same time that Gabby and Brian were in Moab, and yet crickets. The only time the media even mentioned the Schultz and Turner case was to speculate if it was somehow related to Gabby and Brian's case. And it wasn't, by the way. All right, so the elephant in the room here, at least for some of you that are more cynical, is that, I don't know, a lot of people will argue that the only reason Gabby Petito's disappearance and murder became this nationwide sensation is because she was an attractive young white girl. In fact, I'm willing to bet that there's probably a number of you typing that very thing out right now. So stop for just a second, take a deep breath, and hear me out. I do think that there's some truth to that theory. Of course, if Gabby was like an 80-year-old version of someone ugly like me, for instance, then yeah, I doubt that it would have received any media attention. Look at this. It's terrible. But at the same time, I do think that there's a lot more at play here. And you're going to hate me for this, but I think it relates back to social media, something I keep bringing up throughout this video. The contrast between the perfect life that Gabby and Brian portrayed online and their true life and relationship, which was obviously quite troubled, well, that contrast is so stark and frankly morbidly fascinating that I think the contrast is what played a huge role in the virality of this case. There were tons of photos and videos of Gabby and Brian that the public could consume, speculate about, and of course, judge. This case had a clear victim and a clear villain. There were new developments every few days, and the way that Gabby portrayed herself online, well, it just made it easy for people to relate to her, to feel sympathy for her, and of course to disdain anyone who would do her harm. And so folks, this brings us to the truth about Gabby and Brian's story. And once again, I think a lot of you aren't gonna like this because deep down, you probably already know this and maybe you've been suppressing it. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe I'm getting too deep here, but there's a lot of important takeaways from this story. Takeaways about relationships and domestic abuse. And there's also a giant takeaway about something else, something that I happen to know a lot about because, well, it happens to be my job. This takeaway would be about social media, of course. Now, to be clear, I don't blame Gabby Petito for the way that she handled her social media. I don't blame her at all. Who's gonna go on Instagram and post about the relationship problems that you're having or post about how you almost got arrested for domestic violence? I'm not suggesting that, it's wrong to only show the good stuff. I don't blame Gabby at all. I just think that this is a perfect example of the fact that you can't believe that social media is real life. That is the truth about this story. Social media is not real. Again, take it from someone who does social media for a living. The contrast that I've pointed out in this story, of course, is admittedly more dramatic than most, but still. Next time you catch yourself scrolling, comparing your life to other people, and feeling jealous, I just want you to remember this story. Social media is a highlight reel. It's not real life. That's a little slogan I just probably ripped off from someone. I don't know. Maybe this is cynical of me to say, but you never know what dark, even evil secrets are lurking behind the smiles that you see in photos while you're scrolling. May Gabby Petito rest in peace. I encourage all of you to show her some love in the comments section. I always appreciate it when you guys show love to the victims of the stories I cover. This is not a normal photo collection. Behind the 3 snapshots that I'm going to be showing you today are haunting stories, moments frozen in time that capture the calm just before, or strangely enough, after disaster struck. From a normal looking photo, which actually hards a very dark secret, to an unsettling message discovered deep within a national park, these photos are just about the last thing you'd ever want to have on your camera roll. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they're all 100% real. No BS here, folks. Real life can be horrifying, and sometimes this horror gets captured on camera. So with that said, let's take a virtual trip right now to the mountains outside of Santa Barbara, California. This trip I'm taking you on is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. Our goal is to get to 1 million subscribers, and so if you could help us out, double check that if you're subscribed, if you think you are, because weird things happen sometimes. Please help us get to our goal of 1 million subscribers. And okay, let's get into it. In March of 2018, a tired and weary group of 3 returned from a hike on the Cold Springs Trail. I say that they're tired for a very specific reason. Their exhaustion wasn't just related to the miles they'd hiked that day or the elevation that they'd gained. The emotional exhaustion from what they had just experienced on this particular day, well, that weighed on them far more than the exhaustion they felt from the actual hike. In an effort to de-stress, they tossed back a few beers and then they took a look at the photos they had taken that day. And when they did this, what they saw in this photo right here chilled them to the bone. The day before, 2 different hikers, Sailor Gilliams and Brendan Vega, had set out on that very same trail, but quickly found themselves in over their heads. They were both 22 years old and they were not experienced hikers. And that's not to say that you have to be an expert hiker to hike the Cold Springs Trail, but it is clear from this situation that these 2 hikers were not prepared for the terrain. Sailor and Brendan were only planning on being out for a few short hours. And because of this, they didn't bring a simple yet often life-saving piece of equipment that I always encourage everyone to carry on the trail every single time you go hiking. I'm talking about a headlamp. And don't get me wrong, I get it. If you're not planning on night hiking, if you're only planning on being out for like a short hike or something, it makes sense to neglect to bring a headlamp. But here's the problem, and it's quite obvious to be honest with you. If your hike takes even just a little bit longer than you expected, and then the sun suddenly dips below the horizon, that missing light source can and will leave you completely and utterly screwed. This is exactly what happened to Sailor and Brendan. As darkness crept over them, they found themselves stumbling through the wilderness with only their cell phone flashlights to guide the way. And I guess your cell phone light is better than nothing, but it's not the same as a headlamp. It's not even close. This was an already terrifying situation that these 2 hikers found themselves in. But what they didn't realize is that they were on the verge of something far, far worse. With every step that they took, Sailor and Brendan unknowingly ventured deeper into an absolute nightmare, one they couldn't possibly escape in the pitch black wilderness. So Sailor and Brendan are stumbling around in the nighttime woods, and once again, they don't have a headlamp or a flashlight. They only have their phone lights, which is not very good. So they're stumbling around in the dark like this, and then all of a sudden, their situation went from very bad to much, much worse in just the blink of an eye. Their cell phone batteries ran dry, cutting off their only light sources and leaving them to find their way back to the trailhead in total darkness. And then, in a moment that changed everything, Sailor made a leap down from a rock, but the landing went horribly wrong, resulting in a fracture of her left leg. So all of a sudden, she's now just completely immobilized. And obviously, the only thing to do was for Brendan to try and pull off the impossible, which was to carry Sailor to safety in the dead of the night with no reliable light source. This was obviously a very daunting task, to put it mildly, but Brendan, this dude wasn't gonna give up. And so with honestly heroic resolve, he lifted Sailor onto his back and he started inching his way through the dense, pitch black woods, hoping that he was headed in the direction of their car, hoping he was headed to safety. Again, this was absolutely heroic, but I'm just gonna be blunt, it didn't work. Unfortunately, fate just wasn't finished with these two hikers yet. And so not long after lifting Sailor and trying to hike out, Brendan tripped and he crashed to the ground, completely shattering his elbow. Sailor tumbled from his back when this happened, obviously, and this added a broken ankle to her already serious injuries. And so in this moment, they kind of have to pause and just like take stock of what's going around them. And this is when the grim reality set in. They had no choice but for Brendan to leave Sailor behind completely alone in the darkness by herself and for him to go get help. That's a super scary, I mean, can you imagine leaving somebody injured in the pitch black woods like this? I mean, it's just terrible, but yeah, it's the only choice they had. And so Brendan walked away, and neither one of these two realized it at the time, but as Brendan walked away, that would be the last time that they would ever see each other. So Brendan continued on, but there was another major problem at hand. During his fall, Brendan's glasses had been smashed to pieces, which obviously rendered them completely useless. So now, he was trying to make his way out of the nighttime woods without a light source once again, and without being able to see clearly. This, again, heroic but desperate journey would soon end in total heartbreak as Brendan Vega would end up succumbing to the darkness, and Sailor waited in terror, unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded. At some point during his struggle to find the car, Brendan fell about 30 feet, tumbling down a rocky ledge, and was tragically killed. Around 10:30 the next morning, his body was discovered by some other hikers laying only about 15 feet off the trail. But as search and rescue worked to bring his body out of the wilderness, Sailor remained in the woods, completely unable to move and honestly unable to do anything other than scream for help. But eventually she became so weak that she wasn't even really able to do that. That very same afternoon, so this is, the day after Brendan and Sailor went into the woods, the three group of hikers who I mentioned at the beginning of this story set off on the Cold Springs Trail, completely unaware of the nightmare that lay ahead. By around 4 p.m., they actually wandered slightly off the main path and started scaling some rock walls beneath a waterfall. Like most people do when they go hiking, they snapped a few quick photos, without even glancing at the images, before slipping the phone back into a pocket. They had no idea that hidden in those photos, something just straight up disturbing had been captured, something that would turn their adventure into a tale of horror that they would never forget. After taking these photos, one of the hikers, who was named Nicole, noticed something that seemed out of place. Again, they didn't look at the photos, that would come later. Just while they were climbing, while they were hiking, she noticed in the forest below them a, quote, flame of red hair. She sees this and she's looking at it, and at first it's just kind of stationary, it's not moving, but that wouldn't last. Eventually, Nicole saw this red hair move, and when this happened, a chill ran through her because she realized that something was obviously very wrong. With her heart pounding, Nicole led the group down towards this mysterious site, and when they did this, they found her. They found Sailor. They found her sprawled out on the ground, unable to move, barely clinging on to life. The group obviously, instantly grasped the gravity of this scene, and of course they called 911. Due to the difficult terrain in the area, a helicopter was called in, and Sailor was ultimately airlifted out of the wilderness, and folks, she somehow survived. Thank goodness. The actions of these 3 hikers, I'm gonna probably butcher their names here, but Nicole Jerrigan, Joe Filippiano, sorry, and Peter Bivea. Again, I probably got those last names wrong, but long story short, their actions ultimately saved Sailor's life. It's not even up for debate. If they hadn't found her, she probably would have died. And thank God they were there, and thank God they made all of the right decisions. Obviously, finding someone in a situation like that is just absolutely terrifying. And so they stayed with her for a long time. Eventually she got rescued, and then finally they returned home. They left the mountain and they decided to just kind of kick back, try to relax, try to just decompress from this traumatic experience that they had just been through. They cracked a few beers, they tried to shake off the adrenaline, and when they did this, Joe opened his camera roll to kind of scroll through the photos that they'd taken that day. When he did this, a chilling discovery left these 3 hikers just shocked, because in the photos that they just casually snapped, just moments before Nicole had spotted the flash of red hair, well, you could actually see Sailor faintly in the background, barely visible, her red hair just kind of peeking out from the shadows. Sailor had been lying in that exact spot, stranded and helpless, since the previous night. She had been captured in their photos before they even knew that she was there. I can't even imagine what it must have felt like to view these photos and realize what was concealed in the background of them. I mean, could you guys imagine that? Just absolutely insane. Thank God they found her, and my heart goes out to those 3 hikers who saved Sailor's life. My heart goes out to Sailor as well, of course, and also to Brendan Vega and all his friends and family. Brendan's efforts to save Sailor were nothing short of heroic, and so please show him and the rest of the folks in this story some love in the comments. For our next story, I'm going to show you a video that is incredibly disturbing, not because of the actual video itself, but rather because of the events that happened literally right after this individual stopped recording. But before we get there, my give back call out for this week is going to be Santa Barbara County Search and Rescue. My understanding is that they assisted with the recovery of Brendan Vega and the rescue of Sailor. And so I've made a donation to them, and I'd encourage you to do the same. Their website, their details is linked in the description. Thank you so much to everyone who helps me give back.
This is a perfect visual of what we've been dealing with. This is the small one coming down. That's straight shot down. It's very dangerous stuff. There's bigger sections. I mean, all of a sudden, a whole side will come down. Whoa.
That video was recorded by Crystal Gonzalez on January 6th, 2023. She was climbing Mount Baldi in Southern California, and as she illustrated in the video, the conditions that day were very, very dangerous. In fact, going beyond just the video itself, the caption to this post on Facebook where she posted this video read, quote, "This stuff is dangerous. Beware hikers." Unlike the hikers in our previous story, Crystal was actually a very experienced hiker, and she'd even tackled Mount Baldi numerous times before. And also, unlike the previous story, from what I can tell, Crystal was in fact prepared to take on the treacherous winter terrain of Mount Baldi, both in her gear and in her decision making. As you heard in that video, on January 6th, Crystal made the safe decision to abandon her quest for the summit and to turn around and head back down the mountain to safety. And on this day, she made it. Crystal was a 56-year-old mother of 4 who had an immense passion for sharing her adventures on social media. She eventually became known by the nickname the Dancing Hiking Queen. 2 days after she recorded that video, 2 days after she turned around on Mount Baldi, Crystal decided to give it another shot. The date was now January 8th, 2023, which happens to be my birthday, which is kind of a side note, but while I may have been celebrating that day, for Crystal, January 8th would be a day where disaster would strike. Early in the morning, before sunrise even, Crystal was making her way back up Mount Baldi, and she pulled out her cell phone to record this video.
It's go time. Lots of people out today.
Crystal is seen smiling, she's listening to music, and she's just looking generally stoked on life as she ascended Mount Baldi. But only moments after Crystal recorded this video, the California Office of Emergency Services received an SOS message from a Garmin InReach, which declared that a hiker had taken a devastating fall on the mountain. In her last video, Crystal mentioned that there were lots of people hiking Mount Baldi that day. One of these other hikers must have seen Crystal fall and initiated that SOS message from their device in an effort to save her life. A helicopter was immediately dispatched to the coordinates of that SOS call. And by the way, if this isn't reason enough for you to carry something like a Garmin InReach, I don't know what is. I have a bunch of these devices linked to the description. But anyways, this helicopter was able to pretty quickly locate Crystal. And even though this happened fast, unfortunately by this time, Crystal was in critical condition. As fate would have it, Crystal must have slipped or tripped or something like that right after recording that final video. And it's estimated that she slid some 500 to 700 feet down into the famous Baldi Bowl. The helicopter came and they lowered down a medic, and ultimately, after the medic kind of assessed her condition, they decided that they needed to immediately airlift Crystal to the nearest hospital. And yet, despite this heroic rescue effort, Crystal didn't make it. She succumbed to her injuries, around the time that she was airlifted, before she was able to receive the medical attention necessary to save her life. And so that video that she made as she was hiking up Mount Baldi would end up being the last thing that she ever posted to social media. There's definitely not a happy ending to this story, but with that said, I do want to mention that a number of hikers who witnessed Crystal fall went, way out of their way, above and beyond in trying to save her life. In addition to hitting the SOS button to get, medics out there, these hikers supposedly surrounded Crystal and did pretty much everything they could to assist the medics. In fact, one of the medics that was on scene was quoted saying, "It was a terrible situation, but we were able to see some of the best of humanity where the bystanders were helping out." And so I applaud those hikers who risked their own lives to try and save the life of a stranger. And I also want to mention that once again, Crystal Gonzalez was an experienced hiker. I don't know the details of all the gear she had that fateful day, but from all the photos I've seen, she was known to carry the proper gear for winter hiking. I know that she had also summited Mount Whitney in the past, and so she had the experience, she had the gear. It appears to me that this is not the case of an unprepared, ill-equipped hiker making bad decisions and then dying as a result. And that is the case in a lot of the stories I cover on here, a lot of the stories you hear about hikers dying. I don't know why Crystal fell, but if you take anything away from this story, it's just that you should always keep your guard up, even if you know what you're doing and even if you're making all of the safe decisions. My heart goes out to Crystal, her children, and the rest of her friends and family. And once again, guys, please show some love for her in the comments section. For our next story, we're going to be visiting one of the most dangerous national parks in all of the United States. In fact, the very name of this national park is rife with danger because, of course, I'm talking about Death Valley National Park. If you made it this far into the video and you're not yet subscribed, please do that. And so with that said, In the summer of 2010, 3 tourists set out on what was supposed to be a day trip to the park, which holds the record for the hottest temperature ever recorded. That temperature reading was 134.1 degrees Fahrenheit, or 56.7 degrees Celsius, and it was recorded in July of 1913. July is the hottest month in Death Valley, the hottest place on Earth, and it just so happens to be the exact month that Donna Cooper, her daughter Gina, and their friend Jenny Ling decided to visit Death Valley. The beginning of their trip was pleasant, if a bit uneventful. You know, they visited the famous Scotty's Castle for a few hours. Donna bought a t-shirt there, and then the group got back into their Hyundai Ascent to return to their home in Nevada. Little did they know, they would not be making it home. While they were driving out of the national park, they noticed a sign for another famous Death Valley attraction known as the racetrack. They see this sign and they made a split-second decision, an impulsive but also seemingly harmless choice to detour. They turned and they headed for the racetrack, but eventually they realized that something was wrong. I want to take this moment to remind you that this was in 2010. Nowadays, we all just use Google Maps or Apple Maps on our phones to navigate. But back then, a lot of people, probably a lot of you guys watching this, a lot of people used dedicated GPS units to guide their road travel. And in remote places like Death Valley, these GPS units would often lead travelers astray. This is something that happens a lot more than you might realize. It happens so often, in fact, that there's literally a term called death by GPS. You know, for stories where people were led astray by their GPS and then died as a result. So after they veered off the main road, Cooper pressed on through this desolate landscape, driving for miles in search of this elusive racetrack attraction. But as each dusty stretch of road blurred into the next, this famous landmark remained nowhere in sight. The group began to get frustrated, and eventually they just straight up admitted defeat and decided to turn back and to just head home. Yet, as they tried to retrace their steps, Death Valley's endless, identical terrain quickly betrayed them. Instead of finding their way back, they drove deeper and deeper into the barren wilderness, mile after disorienting mile, until an unsettling realization kicked in. The group realized that they were completely lost. However, despite this realization, there was no panic. There was no fear. Donna Cooper simply turned on her GPS, placing her faith in Nell, which was the loyal device that she had named and trusted without question. She was sure that her GPS, Nell, would steer them back to safety. But folks, this did not happen. Nell would end up betraying them. The GPS spiraled them deeper into the wilderness, guiding them in endless circles through this lifeless, brutal desert. Once again, mile after mile, they followed the device's misguided directions, only to be pulled further from any hint of civilization. Eventually, they just gave up on following the GPS entirely. By dusk, the group had traveled over 100 miles in hopeless confusion, their gas gauge now hovering on empty, and their drinking water supply nearly gone. And then, just as the final slivers of light faded, the car shuddered and fell silent. The clock struck 10 p.m., and Donna, Gina, and Jenny were left utterly stranded, alone in the hottest place on Earth. The 3 women now had no other option but to spend the night cramped inside of their car. And when the sun finally rose the following morning, their situation was looking incredibly grim. They were hungry, they were thirsty, and so they began to just kind of scour the barren landscape, desperately searching for any scrape of food, any trace of water, any sliver of hope to escape the unforgiving desert that was now holding them captive. They found a little bit, no water, they found a little bit of food, but not really much. And then later that morning, Gina insisted that they try to start the car again. This seemed kind of pointless I mean, they were out of gas after all. What was going to happen? But at the same time, they didn't really have anything to lose from just trying it one more time. And so Donna slipped the key into the ignition. She turned it, bracing for silence. But then, against all odds, the car engine roared back to life. Maybe, just maybe, this miracle of the car turning back on would give them a fighting chance to survive. At the same time that all of this was going on, across the country, someone else was racing against the clock to save the stranded tourists. Donna's daughter, Sky, had felt an uneasy silence when her mother hadn't checked in with her via phone the night before. Sky, who was Donna's oldest daughter, was also thousands of miles away in the state of Florida, but she sensed that something was deeply wrong. Distance be damned, she was about to find out what the hell had happened to her mother. To do this, Sky resorted to searching through Donna's financial records, and she noticed that her last purchase had been made at Scotty's Castle in Death Valley National Park. And from here, it wasn't hard to surmise that the women were probably lost somewhere inside the park. And so Sky contacted the authorities in California, and the search for the missing tourists was on. With their car sputtering back to life, Donna, Gina, and Jenny didn't waste a single second. They knew that every single drop of gas was precious. And so they pushed onward, rolling down every hill in order to try to stretch their fuel as far as humanly possible. They didn't want to waste any gas. And then, in the shimmering distance, they saw what was basically an oasis. It was a patch of standing trees, which might not seem significant to you, but trees meant water, and water meant hope. If they could find some water, they knew they had a chance to survive. And so they aimed their car directly at this faint lifeline, but just as they approached, the car choked out again, and this time it died for good. There would not be any more miracles from the engine. They were completely out of gas this time for real, but their car had gotten them a lot closer to these trees and thus had gone a long ways in saving their life. The three women got out of their car. They packed up what little belongings they had, which wasn't much because, again, they were only supposed to be there for the day, and then they prepared to set out on foot towards this patch of trees. Thankfully, they weren't very far away at this point because a long trek in the scouring Death Valley heat would have been a certain death sentence. And if you don't believe me, go watch my video about a group known as the Death Valley Germans. So they're getting ready to make this short hike over to this patch of trees, but before the group walked away from their car, they scribbled a very ominous message into the dust on the back of it. It read, quote, "Help. Call police, please." Their message also included an arrow which pointed at the direction that the women would trek. And folks, trek they did. They pushed through the dangerous and brutal heat, and they eventually did reach this oasis of trees. Oh, and by the way, when they reached it, they found much more than they could have ever possibly hoped for. Actually, it wasn't just trees at all that they found. Hidden in these trees was a series of abandoned trailers, and inside the trailers, the women found food. It wasn't exactly ideal. Much of the food was expired, and some of it was like visibly spoiled, but finding this food would obviously significantly increase their chances of survival. And then the women discovered a hose on the back of one of the trailers. They turned the knob for this hose, and with this came the realization that they had found exactly what they were looking for. Folks, water. They found water. When they turned the knob, water poured out of the hose. Now, this water was dirty, and it was also hot. Again, this is Death Valley, and so it wasn't exactly a refreshing drink, but at this point, the women were so desperate to quench their thirst that they didn't even care about this. They now had food, they had water, and they even had the bonus of shelter with these trailers and some of the mattresses inside. But despite having all that stuff, the one thing that they didn't have was rescue, and thus, they settled down for another night in the desert, hoping that somebody, anybody, would find them before it was too late. By the morning of day 3, the search for the missing women was looking very grim. More often than not, being lost in Death Valley for even just a day, especially in the summer like this, is a death sentence, basically. And so on July 25th, as helicopter pilots Tyler Johns and Scott Steele searched from high above, their expectations of finding the women alive were basically zero. At this point, it wasn't even a rescue mission, it was a body recovery mission. But regardless, for 6 long hours, these pilots searched the scorching, desolate landscape from the sky. As their own fuel gauge dipped towards empty, they got ready to abandon the search altogether. You know, at this point, it just wasn't looking good. They'd been searching for so long, they had to call it at some point. But just as they turned to leave, something just felt wrong. It was a feeling they couldn't quite explain, and so against all logic, the pilots decided to take one final pass over the Saline Valley. As they were doing this, they spotted a seemingly abandoned car down below. And then, a bit further up the valley, they spotted a young woman desperately waving a yellow blanket. They obviously were going to investigate this, and so they landed, and they quickly realized that they had found Donna, Gina, and Jenny alive. With this miraculous discovery, gas, supplies, and a guide was brought in, and the women were actually able to drive themselves out of the park. I'm so thankful that they survived, and I want you to remember this photo if you ever plan to take a trip to a remote, unforgiving place like Death Valley. You don't want to end up like these women did. Make sure you have enough food, make sure you have enough water, and make sure you have the proper navigational tools to get you out of trouble if you find yourself in it. My heart goes out to Donna, Gina, and Jenny. I hope they're all doing well now, and I hope all of you stay safe out there on your adventures. So you know that like sick, anxious feeling you get while you're waiting for a really important text message? You know, where you're just checking your phone over and over and over, waiting for that reply. Well, this story starts with me sitting in the middle of the wilderness as the sun's going down while I was in the middle of a weeks-long hike, doing just that, refreshing my phone, you know, just waiting for this reply, super, super anxious to see what the text message said, because I felt like this text message could mean the difference between my life or my death. And in order for you to understand why this text message was so important to me, I need to tell you what might be the most insane story that I've ever covered on this channel. And so with that said, let's take a virtual trip together right now to a very infamous place named Dannemora, New York. Now this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. Our goal for 2025 is to hit 1 million subscribers before the end of the year, which is a very lofty goal, to be honest. And so any help that you can give us by hitting that subscribe button would be amazing, especially if you are a repeat viewer. Okay, I'm willing to bet that unless you already know this story, almost none of you have ever heard of the town Dannemora, New York. I'm sure you've heard of New York State, of course. You know Syracuse, New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, the capital. But you don't know Dannemora, and that's because Dannemora is in what I like to call the forgotten part of New York State. Because believe it or not, there's a lot more to the state than just New York City and those other slightly smaller cities. There's actually a whole part of the state, from the Adirondack Mountains north, even north of the mountains up near Potsdam, where I went to school. There's a whole nother part of the state that doesn't have that much going on and really never gets talked about. And there, deep in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, is where the town of Dannemora is. And what makes Dannemora so significant is that there's a prison right smack in the center of this town. There's lots of towns out there that have prisons in them, but I've never seen a town where the prison walls literally run right next to the main street of the town. Like just across from this giant wall are houses and businesses. I mean, it's such a jarring image to look at. Now, this prison is called the Clinton Correctional Facility, but the truth is that it has a lot of other nicknames, like just Dannemora, or even more infamously, Little Siberia. This is because of how remote the prison is, how far north it is, how cold and crazy the weather gets there, and due to the fact that this prison is a maximum security prison. It's actually the largest maximum security prison in the entire state of New York. It was built in 1877, and it's housed a number of famous inmates over the years, like Tupac, for instance, and a bunch of other ones. It truly is the kind of prison that even the toughest and most dangerous criminals will do anything to avoid being sent to. Oh, and by 2015, there were 2 specific inmates who actually fit that exact profile at this prison. They were tough and they were dangerous. They were both 2 brutal killers. And, well, they were in the process of devising a plan to break the hell out of Dannemora prison for good. And this wasn't just some outlandish, like insane, obviously not going to happen kind of plan. It was a crazy plan, don't get me wrong, but it was actually so crazy that their plan, well, it just might work. Both these dudes had quite the rap sheet. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it here. Richard Matt was serving 25 years to life for torturing and then murdering his former boss, whose name was William Rickerson. That occurred in the year 1997, but it wasn't the only time that Richard Matt had killed, by the way. He was actually convicted of a murder in Mexico a few years later, and he served nearly 10 years in prison there before finally being extradited to New York State in order to face trial for the 1997 murder. And one thing that is interesting to note about Richard Matt's time in prison over the years is that he had a reputation for escape attempts. He had multiple escape attempts, including when he was on trial in 2008. He even had a successful one back in 1986 where he escaped for like 5 days before he was recaptured. You know, this is the kind of inmate that you want to keep an eye on at pretty much all times. You definitely don't want him, I don't know, like on the honor block at your prison, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now to move on to this David Sweat character. So in the early 2000s, David Sweat and 2 other accomplices shot and then ran over a police officer who had kind of interrupted them in the middle of a burglary. And due to this just heinous crime, David Sweat was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And of course, the paths of these 2 brutal killers would eventually cross at the Clinton Correctional Facility, where, as I just alluded to a second ago, they were both housed on the honor block, despite their heinous crimes and despite Richard Matt's history of escapes and escape attempts. One thing that is kind of interesting about these 2 guys is that despite the fact that they're these like brutal, tough killers or whatever, when they first met each other, they actually bonded over painting, like artwork. And, you know, just like, I don't know. I find this kind of funny, to be honest. I guess if you're in prison for life, you don't have much else to do. But like these 2 just like super tough, bad dudes are both just like going over paintings together. And Matt was kind of teaching Sweat how to paint. But if you look at their paintings, it's actually decent work, which is actually something that's going to come into play very shortly here. In addition to bonding over painting, Matt and Sweat both worked and sat together in one of the prison's tailor shops. And it's in this tailor shop that Richard Matt and David Sweat met a woman, a worker, a supervisor, not another inmate, obviously. They met a woman named Joyce Mitchell. Now, Joyce Mitchell was a local to the Dannemora area, and she started working at the Clinton Correctional Facility in 2008, and she eventually became the supervisor in Tailor Shop number 1, where both Matt and Sweat worked. Oh, and by the way, working in this tailor shop as an inmate was a very big deal because, first of all, it's just a better way to pass the time, but more importantly than that, it actually gave the inmates a little bit more freedom than they would have otherwise had. Not a ton of freedom, obviously, they're still inmates in a maximum security prison in the middle of nowhere, New York, but still a little more freedom nonetheless. And when you're locked up for life like that, I can only imagine that every little bit of freedom that you're granted probably means a lot. They're paid a little bit more money, which allows them to spend a little bit more money on food and other items, and that's just even more freedom that they're granted. It's a really big deal. And another way that Richard Matt and David Sweat were able to get a little bit more freedom for themselves was by developing a relationship with Joyce Mitchell. A relationship that was probably a little bit too close. In fact, by this point, Mitchell had kind of built up a reputation amongst the inmates and the other workers at the prison as being someone who got too close to the inmates. And when she met David Sweat and Richard Matt, that was ramped up to a whole new level. It very quickly became apparent to other inmates that Joyce Mitchell had a crush on David Sweat. She had a crush on this cop killer dude locked up for life. I don't know how that happened, probably loneliness and other relationship issues in her personal life, but regardless of how it happened, it most certainly did happen, to the point where inmates were even writing letters to the prison higher-ups trying to like call out this inappropriate relationship that Mitchell had with Sweat and to a lesser degree Matt. She was seen flirting with David Sweat in the tailor shop all of the time. She was putting her arm around him, laughing with him, clearly favoriting him. And there was even some rumors, we'll say, that, well, every now and again, Joyce Mitchell would take David Sweat into the back room to go grab something, and she would end up grabbing something else, if you know what I mean. Yeah, there was rumors that there was a sexual relationship between Joyce Mitchell and David Sweat. This is something that she denied, but nonetheless, there were a lot of inmates who thought this was happening. This went on for some time, but eventually, well, there was enough complaints and they were just so brazen about their relationship, whatever you want to call it, that David Sweat was removed from Tailor Shop 1. And again, this is a big deal for him. Even Joyce Mitchell aside, all that weird stuff, just the fact that he's no longer in the tailor shop is a massive deal, because that's a lot of freedom that was just taken away from him. He's already in prison for his entire life for something that he alleges he didn't do, by the way. And now he doesn't even have the freedom to spend a few extra dollars on better food than the prison food that they're usually given. Now he doesn't have the freedom to see the people that he had developed friendships with in the tailor shop, or the freedom to go in the back room with Joyce Mitchell, allegedly. The fact that he was removed from this tailor shop was a huge deal for David Sweat, and it was also a huge deal for Joyce Mitchell. Apparently, she was extremely enraged when the prison decided to remove Sweat, even to the point where inmates saw her crying over the matter. At one point, Joyce Mitchell even allegedly told Richard Matt, quote, "Hurry up and get Dave back here. I'm horny as f." Now, David Sweat had been fantasizing about breaking out of prison basically since the day he was first locked up, but for most of that time, it was just a fantasy. After being removed from the tailor shop, however, that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. He was so fed up, so sick of his life behind bars, and then this other little thing happens, and finally he's just like, you know what? I gotta figure out a way to get out of here. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's a lot of inmates out there that try to escape, or like say they're gonna escape, and they don't even come close because it's extremely difficult, obviously. And also because a lot of these inmates aren't really the sharpest people out there. I'm just gonna say it, no offense if you're currently serving life in jail and you're watching this, but I'm saying this because David Sweat was not one of these inmates. David Sweat was actually, as much as I hate to give him credit, a very smart dude. And the fact that he had established this relationship with Joyce Mitchell, the fact that he had this friendship with Richard Matt, who's gonna come into play in a second here, I don't know, there was just a lot of different factors that made David Sweat legitimately think that he could escape from this maximum security prison. This wasn't just a fantasy. This wasn't just a pipe dream, although pipes are going to come in shortly here. This was something that could actually happen. And thus, in January of 2015, David Sweat and Richard Matt started legitimately making plans to bust out of Clinton Correctional Facility for good. When David Sweat was kicked out of the tailor shop, this left a vacuum that Richard Matt quickly filled. He kind of swooped in and started to get close to Joyce Mitchell just as David Sweat had, and Richard Matt kind of became the next person that Joyce Mitchell started to build this inappropriate relationship with. Both Sweat and Matt were really, really good at manipulating, and again, Joyce Mitchell was just in a place in her life where she was unfortunately just ripe to be a victim of manipulation. So these two inmates come together and they start to formulate this plan. And at first it's very broad, you know. They decide that once they get out, they need to flee the country as soon as possible. It's almost as if crossing that international border out of the United States would be like some symbol of finally reaching freedom. Like that line is the freedom that they've been seeking. Of course, in reality, it's a little more complicated, but thinking about it from their perspective, you know, they need to just focus on reaching that border before they focus on anything else. And so once they have that part of the plan, they need to figure out how they're going to actually escape from the prison. And this is where Joyce Mitchell comes back in. If they're going to bust out of the prison, they're going to need some tools to help them do that. And at this point, Joyce Mitchell was so close to Richard Matt and David Sweat that she was 100% down to start sneaking in tools to help them with their escape. Richard Matt was quoted saying, she, referring to Joyce Mitchell, she's nuts. She'll bring us whatever we want. Just tell me what you need and I'll get her to bring it in. And so this essentially became the plan for the two men. David Sweat would do the hard work, the route finding, the cutting, everything needed to actually break out of the prison. And Richard Matt, since he was still working in the tailor shop with Joyce Mitchell, well, he would kind of relay information between her and David Sweat, and he would be the one that would kind of manipulate her in order to get tools and other supplies that the prisoners needed. David Sweat's initial plan was to scale the prison wall somehow, but he quickly realized that plan wasn't going to work because, well, his partner in crime, Richard Matt, was very out of shape, to put it mildly. David Sweat was very fit, but Richard Matt was not, and Sweat knew that he wasn't going to be able to scale this wall. And so they abandoned that idea, and then Matt had another idea. Just on the other side of the walls for each prison cell were these catwalks that kind of just led down into the bowels of the prison where all the pipes were. This prison was constructed in the late 1800s, so it's very old. There's just a maze of tunnels and pipes and just like construction stuff right behind the walls of their cells. And both of these men had actually been behind their cells before on the catwalks, which they were not supposed to be doing, but some of the guards had been lackadaisical with them and allowed them to go back there to do some electrical work on their cells and other things like that. And so the men knew that if they could get through their cell walls, they could probably find a way out of the prison. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they felt like it would be possible. And so it didn't take long before Joyce Mitchell was smuggling in hacksaws and other tools through Richard Matt, eventually arriving to David Sweat. The prison workers were supposed to be searched as they came to work every day, but Clinton Correctional Facility was not enforcing this at the time, and Joyce Mitchell used it to her advantage. In addition to that, there was actually another prison worker. This gentleman was an actual guard who Richard Matt and David Sweat had kind of manipulated to help them. His name was Gene Palmer, and I do want to be clear that Gene Palmer did not know about the men's plan to break out of the prison. Joyce Mitchell certainly did. Palmer did not. However, he still was not following prison protocols, and he was helping out Richard Matt in particular by giving him warnings about upcoming cell searches and by giving him escorts to and from the tailor shop without going through metal detectors or other searches, which allowed Richard Matt to smuggle even more tools over to David Sweat. And by the way, remember when I was talking about painting a few minutes ago? Well, the reason that Gene Palmer was doing Richard Matt these favors was because Richard Matt, this is crazy, Richard Matt was making paintings for Gene Palmer and then giving them to him in exchange for these favors. He made him like 10 plus paintings, pictures of his family and other things. Gene Palmer was like smuggling in paint supplies for Richard Matt so that he could paint it for him is super strange. Matt and Joyce were even getting bold enough to hide blades and other tools inside huge chunks of frozen ground beef, and then giving those to Gene Palmer, who did not know that the tools were inside, and then telling him to smuggle the ground beef back to Richard Matt's cell. And I mean, just insane. This sounds like something that is just made up by Hollywood or whatever, but this is all 100% true. And it gets even crazier, so buckle up. First of all, it didn't take long before Richard Matt and Joyce Mitchell also started to develop a sexual relationship, and this is one that Joyce Mitchell actually did admit to. And as if it couldn't get any crazier, well, eventually Joyce Mitchell decided that she was going to join Richard Matt and David Sweat after they escaped and drive them to Mexico and then start a new life with them. And so at the beginning of 2015, both men start cutting through the walls of their prison cells with these tools that had been smuggled in. And every single evening from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. during dinner and recreation time, the two men would be up there cutting through their walls. One person would stand guard as the other person cut, and then they would trade off every 15 minutes or so. And it really didn't take long for them to finish their holes in their cell walls. David Sweat finished in about 3 weeks, and Matt finished in about 4. And so now that they have these giant holes in their cells, they have to hide them somehow, of course. David Sweat went to great lengths to kind of mask the hole that he had cut in his wall. He got some tape, and he would like tape over the lines of the hole, the cut lines, and then he actually had paint that was matching to the wall color of his cell, because the officers would give that to inmates sometimes so they could touch up the paint jobs in their cell, which is crazy to me, but he had this paint, and so he would tape over the cut lines, paint them over, and then you couldn't even tell that he had cut this hole behind his bed in the wall. However, despite David Sweat's effort to cover his hole up, he was quite worried about his friend Richard Matt's hole. He saw it a couple times, and he was like, dude, you're not hiding this hole very well. There's an entire theme throughout this story of David Sweat not really trusting Richard Matt, or being worried that Matt was gonna kind of blow the whole plan. And Matt's cell was even searched one day according to prison records, but they didn't find the hole. And this is probably because the search never actually happened and was likely forged in the records. And so the holes in the two men's cell walls were never found. And now it was time for David Sweat to search for a potential route out of the prison. So from the very first night that David Sweat finished the hole in his cell wall, he would go out after 11 p.m. and start searching for a route out of the prison. He's kind of just exploring around, wandering around on the catwalks in the back of the prison. For David Sweat, this was a very significant thing, not only because it was another step towards breaking out, but because being out of his cell, being in a place he wasn't supposed to be, kind of on his own terms like this, was this taste of freedom that was just so amazing for him. He was quoted saying, "It felt good because you kind of felt free. You know, you weren't caged up in the cell no more. Nobody knew where you were. It was something new. It was doing something that I could actually use my mind for, that I could apply myself to." At one point, while David Sweat was exploring the catwalk, he was almost hit by a cigarette that a guard, floors above him, had kind of just discarded. It was still a lit cigarette, and it nearly struck David Sweat on the top of his head. But of course, he didn't care as long as he didn't get caught. And while he was exploring around trying to find a way out of the prison, he found even more tools that he could use in his escape. These were tools that had been just left there by workers, probably years ago. This prison is so old again. And they never imagined that any inmates would be in this part of the prison. The only people that really should have been there were workers and guards for the most part. And so people just left tools around, and David Sweat found them, and he used them to his advantage. He worked for months to try and find a way out of the prison. Every single night, 11 p.m. was when the last count would be before the morning. And so right after the guards passed his cell, he would slip down underneath his bed. He would pull out the part of the wall that he had cut, and then he would get into the catwalk and he would just go. And eventually he came across a major obstacle, a literal and figural wall blocking his progress. This wall was made of bricks. And so after searching, trying to find another way around this wall, David Sweat realized that his only option was to bust through this brick wall. And so how is an inmate supposed to break through a giant wall like this? Well, with a lot of hard work, a lot of patience, and some stolen tools. That's how. David Sweat worked night after night, busting the bricks out of this wall. But he wasn't just breaking down the wall. Every single night, once he was done working and he needed to get back to his cell before the morning head count, he would replace each brick that he had busted out so that if someone did come across the wall, they wouldn't notice that anything was out of place, which I think is absolutely incredible. It's just another example of how just crazy this story is. The attention to detail that this guy had when it came to his ambitious plan. He does this for months, and eventually he's able to get through the wall. And so now every single night he's going down there, he's getting through this brick wall, and he's trying to find the actual wall of the prison. That wall that you can see, you know, the other side of, obviously, in the photos of downtown Dannemora, New York. It took David Sweat many months to get there, but eventually, towards the end of the spring, he found the wall. He literally walked and it broke his way from his cell all the way to the final wall of the prison. On the other side of that wall, folks, was freedom. All he had to do was get through it. And this was not going to be easy. David Sweat passed on the news that he had reached the final wall to Richard Matt, who then passed on the news to Joyce Mitchell. They knew at this point that they were extremely close to breaking out, and so they started to make their final plans for when the men actually broke out, the things that were going to happen next. And, well, it's quite incredible. The two men convinced Joyce Mitchell of this plan. Step one, meet them outside of the prison walls in her vehicle so she could pick them up. Step two, drive to Joyce Mitchell's house so that the two men could kill her husband, who also worked at the prison, by the way. Step three was then to hightail it out of northern New York all the way down to the country of Mexico, once again reaching that international border, that line that marked freedom for them, and then start a new life. The part that the two men didn't tell Joyce Mitchell, and to be honest, it's not clear even to this day, is what they planned to do with her once they did reach Mexico. It's been speculated that they probably were going to kill her too at that point, having gotten everything they needed out of her. We don't know for sure if that was going to happen, but that was their rough plan. The only thing left at this point was to actually get through that final wall. And David Sweat realized that he actually would be able to do this relatively quickly. This time, he wasn't going to just bust through the wall. I mean, this wall was much bigger, much thicker. That wouldn't have been possible. However, there was a steam pipe that ran through the wall. And David Sweat realized that he could actually cut into the steam pipe and then get in the pipe, travel through it until he reached the other side of the wall, and then cut an exit hole and then pop out. And so this is what he did. It took about 2 weeks for him to cut the first hole into the steam pipe. And then he got inside the pipe, which is a total nightmare if you're claustrophobic. Can you imagine this? Like, you're in a steam pipe cramped in there. It was barely big enough for him. He gets in there and then he inches his way through the pipe, you know, underneath the wall. And he has to kind of guess and calculate where to cut the exit hole, because if he cuts it too soon, he's still going to be on the inside of the wall, or maybe there'll be some other obstacle there. Oh, and another thing, by the way, when you're cramped inside of a pipe like this, it was getting extremely hot and stuffy. And so David Sweat literally created a ventilation system for himself while he was working on the exit hole of the pipe. He took a fan and some plastic bags and kind of just like sealed them behind him in the entrance hole so that it was blowing fresh air into the pipe so he wasn't just like suffocating in there. He was going all out, folks. And eventually he was able to finish that exit hole. He finishes cutting and he punches through on June 5th, 2015. And as soon as he does this, he starts looking for a manhole because he knows once he finds a manhole, it's going to pop him out outside the prison. And he finds one, but he's kind of like looking through a little bit and he notices it's near this facility. There's like workers around and stuff, or he fears there might be. And so he's like, that's not really a good one. And so he backtracks a little bit and he eventually finds this manhole right here. You're looking at this on Google Street View right now. And, you know, it's kind of a crazy scene with the prison in the background there, but this manhole right here is so significant, such a famous spot at this point, even though it doesn't really look like it, because this is the manhole that on the night of June 5th, David Sweat popped open and poked his head out of, realizing for the first time that he had literally broken his way out of prison. This pipe dream, this thing he had been working towards since January, well, he had succeeded. And the crazy thing is he literally could have just ran off in that moment. He was out. He could have done it. But him and Richard Matt had made a plan. There's no way that David Sweat could have made it that far without Richard Matt because he was the one kind of manipulating Joyce Mitchell. And so David Sweat, in a weird way, did like the honorable thing. And instead of busting out in that moment and just saying screw it and running, he decided to wait. And so he was literally free at that moment. And he goes back into the prison, climbs all the way back up to his cell, and he tells Richard Matt, tomorrow is the night. We're doing it. And so the very next night, this is June 6th, 2015, the 11 p.m. head count happens, and then immediately after, the two men start to make their preparations. Richard Matt was even getting a little cocky with it. He left a few notes for the guards and everybody else to find when they inevitably realized the two prisoners were missing. He was basically taunting them. He left a note that read, quote, "You left me no choice but to grow old and die in here. I had to do something." He also left one of his paintings with a note that said, "Time to go, kid." And the two of them also left this very strange racist note on the steam pipe. It just read, "Have a nice day." And apparently this note had been given to the men like a few days before they broke out, and it didn't really have any, they weren't really trying to send any like grand message with it. They just thought it was kind of funny and they left it there. Either way, it was very strange. And they also, in classic, you know, prison break style, the two men left dummies in their beds, in the beds of their cell, so that if the guards did come by, if they weren't paying very close attention, it would kind of look like they were still in their beds. I mean, you literally can't make this stuff up, folks. It's absolutely insane. And another thing you can't make up is that Richard Matt had a hell of a time getting through the steam pipe. Again, Richard Matt wasn't exactly in the best shape. He had lost some weight leading up to this escape, mostly at David Sweat's insistence because he knew how tight that steam pipe was, and he knew Richard Matt was a little bit of a big boy. He might not fit. And turns out Richard Matt did fit, but just barely. He was so cramped in there and so claustrophobic and freaking out that David Sweat literally had to pull him through with a bed sheet. Oh, and by the way, during this process, Matt's pants actually fell down, to which David Sweat said, quote, "Oh, Matt, I didn't know you cared." But despite this setback, you could say, the two men were successful. They reached the manhole, they popped out just before midnight, and all they had to do now was wait for Joyce Mitchell with their getaway car. Remember, there's like houses and stuff around this manhole. It's just like a little neighborhood, you know, right outside the prison. And after they came out of the manhole, a car drove by, which obviously freaked the men out, particularly freaked out Richard Matt because he went running into someone's yard to try to hide. But then it turns out that the car turned into that very same property. And so right from the beginning, literally the moment after they emerged, their entire plot was almost foiled. However, David Sweat was quick thinking, and he told the person that pulled into this house who yelled at them and was like, "What are you guys doing?" David Sweat told them that they were just looking for another house. They were on the wrong street. They were confused. He apologized, and then the two men kind of just scurried away. So they dodged that bullet, but shortly after this happened, they quickly realized that a major part of their plan was screwed. To put it mildly. Joyce Mitchell, she bailed. She didn't show up. She didn't follow through with the plans that she had been working towards for months, with these two inmates. She actually, at this time, was in the hospital. She had checked herself into the hospital. She hadn't told anyone what was going on, but she was having a panic attack. And instead of picking the men up, she went to the hospital. And so they're standing around waiting for her, not realizing that she's literally hooked up to an IV or something somewhere else. She doesn't show up, and the men waited for a little bit before they eventually realized it wasn't going to happen. And so in that moment, just like that, now, instead of heading towards Mexico as that line of freedom, they had to change their plan, and they had to change the line a lot further north. So now, all of a sudden, Canada is the goal. Canada is that international line that marks their freedom. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. Of course, the Canadian officials are going to be looking for them too, but that's all they're thinking about. We got to make it to Canada now. We have no choice. And so the two men just head off into the woods and slowly start to make their way north towards the land of hockey and poutine. The very next morning, at the 5:30 a.m. head count, the guards discover that Richard Matt and David Sweat are nowhere to be found. The holes in their cell walls are quickly found, and it didn't take long at all for the prison officials to realize what had happened, to even follow the exact route that the men took out. They found their notes taunting them, and within just a few hours, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was standing in the prisoners' cells, surveying what had happened, trying to get to the bottom of this. Again, this is a maximum security prison. This kind of thing is not supposed to happen. These are two convicted killers, just brutal, brutal people. The fact that they escaped from a prison like this was unbelievable. And so it was just a massive deal. There's cameras everywhere covering this. It's all over national news. And very quickly, sightings of the two men who are now on the run started to just pour in from all over the area. Not even just the area, actually. All over the state, even all over the country. A massive manhunt is started, but within a few days, they still had zero clues. They still had no idea where the men were. And that's because the area that this prison is in, once again, it's extremely remote. This is the Adirondack Mountains. It's rural, it's forested, it's rugged. It's not an easy area to search. There's a lot of just wilderness that the men could be hiding in. There's tons of small little cabins and hunting camps. And actually, if it wasn't for those cabins, the men probably would have died or been found very quickly. Their plan essentially was to move at night and search for various either abandoned or unoccupied cabins. And they actually found a number of them. And inside the cabins, Matt and Sweat found food, water, supplies. They also found a shotgun, and they found alcohol, which was something that Richard Matt quickly started to hit quite hard. Again, he's been locked up for years, since the late 90s, and so he hasn't had a drink since then, and all of a sudden he's got just, what seems like an endless supply of liquor in front of him. He's stealing liquor and beer from these cabins. And so he's like, screw it. Why not? I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to start getting drunk. I'm going to let loose. I'm finally free. And, you can kind of sympathize with that mindset, but it's important to note that David Sweat was the exact opposite. He didn't touch the alcohol at all, because for David Sweat, he wasn't free yet. He had a taste of freedom at this point, but he wasn't free. He needed to reach that Canadian border, and he needed to settle in somewhere so he could just start his life over. And so he was very aware that he was on the run. This was not the time to party and let loose. This was the time to evade capture. And as the days dragged on, he starts to realize that the thing he had been suspecting deep down right from the very beginning was true, which was that Richard Matt, he was just slowing him down. Again, he needed Matt in order to actually break out of the prison, but at this point, he didn't really need him anymore. Matt was obviously not in as good a shape as Sweat. He couldn't move as quick, and he was getting drunk now. He had a shotgun. And so by June 23rd, David Sweat decides that he's just going to ditch Matt altogether. He's done with it. And so what he does is, while they're moving through the woods, all of a sudden he's like, look, there's cops over there. He kind of like gets frantic and spooks Matt, and then he just runs off. And he's like, we got to run. And so the two men start running, and of course David Sweat is a lot faster, and he just straight up ditches Matt. He just runs away. He lied to him. He fooled him, and he felt a little bit bad about this, but at the same time, he had literally broken this dude out of prison. Like, Matt wouldn't have been able to get out without Sweat. And so he's like, you know what? I've done this guy enough favors. He's going to lead to me getting captured if I don't ditch him. And so he did it. And it didn't take long after this for Richard Matt to finally meet his end. Flash forward to June 26th, 2015. By this point, the authorities are hot on the tail of the two suspects. Some of the cabins that they had broken into had been discovered, vandalized. They had even done some DNA testing and confirmed that the two inmates had been in some of these cabins. And so they were getting very, very close to catching them. And so on June 26th, investigators were searching a cabin right off of Route 30, a little bit south of Malone, New York, which is a town I know very well. I've driven through there 1,000 times. They're searching this cabin, and then all of a sudden, they hear a gunshot. And it turns out that a camper had been driving down Route 30. They had also heard the gunshot, and then they pulled over and found a bullet hole in their camper. And so they report this to the authorities. The authorities kind of converge on the area where they think the shot came from, and they're looking around. They don't see anything yet, but then they hear a cough. One of the searchers turns around, and he sees Richard Matt lying on the ground with a shotgun pointed right at him. And so this searcher, who I believe was a Border Patrol agent, something like that, he doesn't waste any time defending himself and his colleagues. He opens fire, and he hits Matt in the head, and he kills him. And so this marked the end of Richard Matt's escape. The booze did him in, being out of shape did him in. He didn't make it. And so this is obviously a major break in the case, but the authorities, the governor, everyone is still very confused because where's David Sweat? He's nowhere to be found. The two men should have been together, right? But they weren't. They knew he must have been close. And so they ramp up the search even more. At this point, all resources converge on the Malone, New York area. And then 2 days later, on June 28th, David Sweat decides to make a very bold move. At this point, he was actually a little bit north of Malone, New York. He was hiding out in a little town called Constable, actually hiding out in a deer stand that he had found. He was only moving at night at this point to try to kind of evade capture, but he had been seeing a lot of signs of the searchers. At one point, he had even been up in the tree stand and watched a searcher walk right by the tree down below without noticing him. He's really feeling the pressure. He's really feeling the heat. And so on June 28th, David Sweat decides that he can't wait any longer. He needs to make a run for it, and he just can't do it at night. He needs to just go for it right now. And so he starts to move north just as he had been doing, and he makes it to this field in Constable, New York. And at the very same time that he emerges into this field, a New York State trooper named Jay Cook just so happened to be driving by on this rural road that kind of butts up against the field. And Jay Cook sees this man standing in the field. He's wearing camouflage. His initial thought is that it's actually another searcher, and he looks kind of confused and kind of lost. And so Jay Cook parks his car and actually yells out to this person to try and figure out what they're doing and maybe to help them. However, when he yells out, asking if he needs any help, the man just kind of waves him off. Like, nah, I'm fine. Just, leave me alone or whatever. And it's at this moment that Jay Cook realizes that's David Sweat. That's the guy we've been looking for. That's him right there. David Sweat takes off running at this point. Again, he's in a field. If he can make it to the tree line, then he probably is at least going to stand a chance of getting away. Of course, Jay Cook knows this as well. And so when David Sweat starts running, he pursues him. He follows him, and he's yelling out to him, telling him, if you don't stop, I'm going to shoot you. I have no choice. This predictably did not dissuade David Sweat. And so eventually, Jay Cook stops. He pulls out his gun, and he starts firing at David Sweat. He takes 2 shots. He hits both of them, and David Sweat falls to the ground just before the tree line. Jay Cook runs up to him. He handcuffs him. Backup arrives, and it's at this moment that the true gravity of what had just happened sinks in, because the police realize that David Sweat, from the location he was shot and handcuffed, David Sweat was only a mile and a half from the Canadian border. That close to that line of freedom that he had been seeking for so long. Now, Sweat did not die, unlike Richard Matt. Sweat survived. Of course, he was seriously injured. He was brought to the hospital, and he started to tell his story. He was very proud. Despite the fact that he had been captured, he was very, very proud. Now, on June 6th, 2015, which again was the day that the prisoners emerged from that manhole and escaped, I myself was on a backpacking trip, a through hike actually, of the Northville Placid Trail in the Adirondacks, which is very insane because out of all of the trails in the United States that I could have been on, I just so happened to be on the very trail in the very same mountains at the very same time that these two killers escaped and were now on the loose end. But of course, when this happened, I was hiking through the wilderness, so I had no idea at first. I had no way of knowing about this breaking story that was unfolding just a little bit north of my location on the trail at the time. But then, on day 7 of this hike, I finally got a tiny little bit of cell service, and when this happened, I got a text message from my mom. Now, this text message shook me to my core. This is what it read. Warning, 2 extremely dangerous criminals escaped from prison today in upstate New York. 2 white men. We will send you pictures. Dad wanted me to alert you. Be safe. Folks, that is about the last thing that you want to read when you're in the middle of the woods just before the sun was setting, just before dark. That's when I got the text. Now, I didn't have a data plan on my cell phone back then, and so, I couldn't just Google what was happening. I had to rely on my mom to text me back and to give me more details about what was happening, mostly where the prison was that this break occurred from. Because again, in her text message, she had written, the escape happened from a prison in upstate New York. And for those of you that don't know, upstate New York refers to any part of the state that's not New York City. And so if this escape had happened in Buffalo, for instance, I wouldn't have cared at all. It wouldn't have made me nervous. That was hours and hours away. That's not my area. But my friend that I was hiking with happened to know that there was a maximum security prison called Dannemora that was located very close to where we were hiking at the time. And so I'm waiting for my mom to respond to tell me where the actual prison was. And I'm just getting more and more anxious with each passing moment. And I was just praying that she wasn't going to tell me that the escape had happened from Dannemora. But sure enough, as you all know at this point, she did eventually get back to me and confirmed my worst fear in that moment. And so the very next morning, we got the hell off this trail for good. We quit because we didn't know what direction these killers had been traveling in. Now, in hindsight, as I'm sure a number of you are going to point out in the comments, I was definitely being overly paranoid because the 2 men didn't even end up traveling in my direction. They were traveling north. We were a little bit south of the prison, so we could have continued. We would have been fine. Even if they were going in our direction, the chance that they were going to see us is obviously tiny. And I'm a little bit embarrassed about how much I freaked out about this at the time. Because as soon as I heard about this escape, I was like, I want to be off this trail. I freaked out. You can ask my friend. It's kind of embarrassing, but thankfully I did end up going back a few years later and successfully completed the Northville Placid Trail with no prison escapes this time. David Sweat would go on to get a few extra years tacked on to his life sentence for this escape. Joyce Mitchell would end up being sentenced to up to 7 years in prison for helping in the escape. She ended up getting released a little bit early on parole back in 2020. And this entire story revealed massive problems and corruption within the Clinton Correctional Facility. This is one of the most alarming and astonishing things about this story to me. This escape would not have been possible if prison staff had actually been following proper procedure. Now, Joyce Mitchell and Gene Palmer were the 2 prison workers who got the most blame, but there was also a lot of other workers that were doing all sorts of illegal and corrupt things, or negligent things. And this entire story just kind of blew all of this stuff wide open. And just to illustrate to you how bad things were in this prison, here's a direct quote from an official New York State report on this prison break. Quote, "In the time Sweat was out of his cell over a 3-month period, while he was breaking out and searching and stuff, a total of more than 400 counts should have been conducted. If only one of the counts was done properly, the escape plan would have been instantly stopped." On the morning of November 10th, 1990, 21-year-old Jamie Paxton set out into the woods to go hunting. Little did he know, he was stepping into the crosshairs of a predator. And before the day was over, Jamie Paxton was gunned down in brutal fashion. His mother, completely devastated, took some unusual actions and actually tried to reach out to her son's killer by writing him letters which were published in the local newspaper. "Unless you confess your sin and ask for God's forgiveness, you will face the fire and fury of hell. We want to know why Jamie was killed." The police told her that writing these letters was useless. The killer either wouldn't see them or he just didn't care. But then, after a year of calling the killer out in her writing, the local newspaper received a horrific response letter in the mail. "I am the murderer of Jamie Paxton. 5 minutes after I shot Paxton, I was drinking a beer and had blocked out all thoughts of what I had just done out of my mind. I thought no more of shooting Paxton than shooting a bottle at the dump." The letter was obviously shocking, but what was even more shocking is that this letter was much more than just a confession to the one murder. This letter was the first clue into a web of violence and, yes, murder, a web that was so evil that even the FBI was left stunned. When they read this letter, they instantly knew that they were looking for the worst and most elusive type of criminal, a serial killer who hunted humans for fun. Folks, this is the story of the Ohio Outdoorsman killer. When most people picture a crime scene, they usually picture, a city street, the inside of a home, or maybe even a bank. They usually don't picture a peaceful, green, rural setting. But for our story today, that's exactly where we're going. So with that said, let's take a trip together right now to rural Ohio. This trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. So that's right, destroy the subscribe button, do it right now, and okay, let's head to Tuscarora County, Ohio. On the crisp morning of April 1st, 1989, 35-year-old Donald Welling laced up his running shoes and set out for a jog along the quiet rural dirt roads near his home. It just so happened to be April Fool's Day, but there was no humor in what fate had in store for Donald. He would end up being gunned down at point-blank range, his body left to rot on the side of the road. Now, investigators quickly swarmed the scene, but they were disappointed to find that the killer had left approximately 0 evidence behind. And thus, Donald's killing seemed like it was an isolated incident, and the case quickly went cold. And then, over a year later, on November 10th, 1990, 21-year-old Jamie Paxton awoke early in the morning to go out and partake in his favorite pastime. That was hunting. He grabbed his crossbow, he said goodbye to his parents that he lived with, and then he set off from his Belmont County home, eager to go find the perfect spot to bag a deer. He drove for a while, and then he finally found a very promising field which was located just off of Route 9. He pulled in, he parked his truck, and then he actually strolled into the field completely unarmed in order to just kind of feel things out, to kind of just, scope things out. He was so focused on doing that he never noticed the red pickup truck that pulled in behind his car. Jamie Paxton never returned from his hunt. His body was found in that very same field, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. No shell casings, no footprints, or any other evidence was found at the scene. Jamie Paxton had no known enemies, and the motive for his brutal murder was entirely unknown. His killing, like the killing of Donald Welling, seemed as random as it was brutal. But together, these two killings hinted at something far darker that was lurking in the shadows, a connection that I'm making sound obvious, but the authorities had not yet to make. 18 days after Jamie Paxton's murder, 30-year-old Kevin Loring went out hunting in Muskingum County, Ohio. Loring actually wasn't from Ohio. He was from Duxbury, Massachusetts, but he had traveled to Ohio in order to visit some friends and, of course, to do what he loved, aka hunting. He really wanted to bag a deer. So Loring and his friends set out early in the morning, but at some point, the group had separated. Kevin Loring's friends never saw him again. Kevin went missing until he was discovered the very next day, dead from a gunshot wound. Now, at first, authorities dismissed this tragedy as a hunting accident, which is a rare but not exactly unheard of occurrence in the remote Ohio countryside. Kevin Loring's family, left totally shattered by his loss, began to grieve the man who was a father of 3 young children. And to them, this was a senseless and heartbreaking loss, but it was nothing more. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't something that was going to turn into a national case. His family couldn't have known the truth that was just lurking out of reach at the time, but within months, the investigation into Kevin's death would be reopened, and this chilling reality would emerge. Kevin Loring's death was no hunting accident. In fact, Kevin Loring had actually been hunted himself. Flash forward to March 14th, 1992, and 49-year-old Claude Hawkins has just finished working his overnight shift at the perfect time to go enjoy some morning fishing. The Wills Creek Dam in Coshocton County, Ohio, was his favorite fishing spot. It was a quiet refuge where he could just relax after a long night's work overnight. Tragically, Claude was found dead at this very spot that he loved so much, his fishing pole lying abandoned beside him. Claude had been killed by a gunshot fired at extremely close range. Now, he had actually been standing on federal land when he was shot, which placed the investigation into the hands of the FBI. As these FBI agents combed through the case, they began to uncover a terrifying truth. Claude's murder wasn't a standalone act of violence. It was part of something far bigger and far more sinister. Up until now, the 3 murders and the 1 accident that I've told you about so far weren't connected. The authorities hadn't pieced it together. Each of these crimes occurred in a different rural county scattered across Ohio with limited local resources to tie them together. Investigators in one county had no idea that their case might be linked to another county, leaving the crimes isolated in their records. But when the FBI stepped in, the pattern became unmistakable. The murders weren't just random acts of violence. They were meticulously calculated, each one committed in a location designed to stay just out of reach of local authorities. This killer had woven a web of terror across the state of Ohio, exploiting jurisdictional gaps in order to remain undetected. To the FBI, it was clear they weren't just dealing with a killer. They were hunting a predator who had mastered the art of evasion and the evil act of hunting itself. When the FBI took over the investigation, they uncovered the chilling truth that Kevin Loring's death hadn't been a hunting accident after all. And with this revelation, Loring's name was added to the growing list of victims that were claimed by this elusive and calculating serial killer. Next, the FBI took a close look at all 4 murders, and when they did this, they came to an extremely troubling realization. There was almost zero evidence in any of these cases. The killer had been super careful. He had removed shell casings. He didn't leave any DNA. He didn't leave any fingerprints. He left no trace of his presence. The only lead that the FBI had was a single typed letter received by the Ferry Times Leader newspaper on November 4th, 1991. This letter's origin lay in the grief-stricken determination of one woman. That would be Jamie Paxton's mother, Jean Paxton. Devastated by her son's brutal death, Jean refused to stand by and just wait for justice. Instead, she took an extraordinary step and she poured her anguish, her heartbreak, and all of her emotions into open letters addressed to her son's killer. These letters were filled with confusion, desperation, pleas, just very brutal stuff, and they were published in the Ferry Times Leader for the world, the entire world, and the killer to see. Little did Jean know, but her words would eventually spark a response that would shock everybody. She wrote, "To the murderer of my son, Jamie, would it be easier for you if I wrote words of hate? I can't, because I don't feel hate. I feel deep sorrow at losing my son. You took a light from my life November 10th and left me with many days of darkness. Have you thought of your own death? Unless you confess your sin and ask for God's forgiveness, you will face the fire and fury of hell. When you are caught, I will be sorry for your family. They will have to carry the burden of your guilt all their lives." I want to stress that this was not just a one-off letter, folks. Jean Paxton published letter after letter addressed to her son's killer. She did this for almost a year. Oh, and by the way, she did this without ever getting a response. But then, just before the 1-year anniversary of her son's death, this disturbing letter arrived at the Ferry Times Leader. "I am the murderer of Jamie Paxton. Jamie Paxton was a complete stranger to me. I never saw him before in my life, and he never said a word to me that Saturday. Paxton was killed because of an irresistible compulsion that has taken over my life. I knew when I left my house that day that someone would die by my hand. Technically, I meet the definition of a serial killer, but I'm an average-looking person with a family, job, and home just like yourself. Something in my head causes me to turn into a merciless killer with no conscience. To the Paxtons, you deserve to know the details." And folks, go into the details he did. The anonymous typewritten letter went on to say, quote, "I raised my rifle to my shoulder and lined him up in the sights. It took at least 5 seconds to take careful aim. My first shot was off a little bit and hit him in the right chest. He groaned and went down. I wanted to make sure he was finished, so I fired a second shot aimed halfway between his hip and shoulder. He was crawling around on the ground. I jerked the shot and hit him in the knee. He raised his head and groaned again. My third shot also missed and hit him in the butt. He never moved again." The letter continued on, but by this point in it, the FBI knew that this letter was not a hoax. They knew that the real killer had to have written it because he had given details in the letter, details about the killing of Jamie Paxton that were not public. I'm talking details that only the FBI and the killer himself could possibly know. The letter went on, showing just how cold and evil this mysterious man truly was. 5 minutes after I shot Paxton, I was drinking a beer and had blocked out all thoughts of what I had just done out of my mind. I thought no more of shooting Paxton than shooting a bottle at the dump. Signed, the murderer of Jamie Paxton. Now, those are probably some of the most disturbing words I've ever read out loud before. Now, this letter didn't contain any fingerprints. It didn't contain any DNA. It didn't contain anything at all that would point in the direction of who this serial killer was. At first, the letter seemed like yet another hopeless lead. But the FBI soon realized that the letter was actually riddled with evidence that could help capture this monster who was roaming Ohio's backroads. All the FBI had to do was just get a little more creative. The FBI studied every little detail about this letter. They studied the author's word choice, the tone that he wrote in, even the cadence of his sentences. And what they were doing was putting together a behavioral profile of the Ohio outdoorsman killer, attempting to understand his personality, his habits, and of course, his motivations. The FBI and local investigators would end up forming a task force designed to finally bring down this serial killer. And just a few days after this task force first met, 44-year-old Gary Bradley left his home in West Virginia, crossed into the state of Ohio, and settled in at a fishing spot in Noble County. His secluded location made it a perfect place for a quiet escape, or so Gary thought, but what he didn't realize was that he wasn't alone. Undetected, the Ohio outdoorsman killer had already marked Gary as prey in the deadliest game imaginable. Like the victims before him, Gary Bradley was mercilessly gunned down with a high-powered rifle. When investigators arrived, they were met with the same frustrating reality as all of the previous cases. There was no shell casings, no fingerprints. There was no leads at all. Nothing pointed to who did this. The only thing they had were a couple tiny fragments of some of the bullets that were extracted from Gary's body, which would go on to match some of the bullets that killed Claude Hawkins, which confirmed the FBI's worst fear. The very same cold-blooded killer that they were trying so desperately to track down had killed Gary Bradley. And thus, the FBI sheepishly added a fifth person to the list of victims from this serial killer. And they did this, and then without looking back, they dove into the killer's psyche, ramping up their efforts to create this profile that might finally bring this hunter of men to justice. They knew that they had to act fast because it was crystal clear that the Ohio outdoorsman killer would not be stopping his rampage anytime soon. So they're trying to create this profile, and the only even slight glimpse into the mind of this killer was from that letter that was sent to Gene Paxton. Other than that, the only things they had to go off of were the actual details of the 5 murders. And they quickly noticed that all 5 murder victims were in the process of enjoying the outdoors when they were killed. They were either hunting, fishing, or jogging. The FBI also noticed that most of the slayings occurred on a Saturday. And finally, they noticed that all victims were men. The FBI's behavioral profile painted a chilling picture of the Ohio outdoorsman killer. They concluded that he was likely a white male, he was likely over 30 years old, with a deeply introverted nature. But at the same time, he wasn't a recluse. You know, he was skilled, he was calculated, and he was comfortable, even you could say dangerously comfortable, in the wilderness. The killer was probably an avid outdoorsman himself, someone who knew how to hunt, fish, and certainly someone who knew how to handle firearms with expert precision. The profile didn't stop there either. It suggested a disturbing pattern of criminal habits beyond just these murders. The killer was likely an alcoholic, prone to drinking himself into reckless acts of destruction, things like vandalism, shooting at empty vehicles, setting fires, and even torturing animals. These were the dark hobbies of a man who had basically grown numb to violence. He likely lived close enough to all of his victims so that he could strike quickly and strike without hesitation, blending back into the rural fabric of Ohio with total ease. So that's what they came up with. That's how they profiled this killer. And at first, they used this profile to try and narrow down their list of suspects. However, this didn't bring them any closer to finding the identity of the killer. By the start of August in 1992, they were feeling more and more pressure to do this. The killer could basically strike again at any moment, and the FBI knew that they were running out of time. This desperation would lead the FBI to a very bold decision. They decided that they were going to go public with their profile. So they unleashed this profile to the press in the hopes that someone, anyone, might recognize the monster hiding in plain sight. And by the way, the FBI didn't just release their behavioral profile, they released a chilling warning. With hunting season on the horizon, the FBI cautioned the public that while most sportsmen would be aiming for deer, one man was going to be preparing to actually hunt the hunters. The FBI's announcement sent shockwaves throughout the state of Ohio, sparking widespread fear and intense media attention. Pretty much immediately upon releasing this, the FBI was bombarded with tips and also with new suspects. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, but it also didn't take long for one individual lead to rise above the rest of the noise. A man stepped forward claiming that a former friend of his matched the behavioral profile of the killer almost perfectly. Now, the FBI was skeptical at first, but of course, they dug into this lead. And when they did this, what they found left no doubt. This informant was 100% telling the truth. And so for the first time, the FBI had a potential name that could actually be tied to the Ohio Outdoorsman killer. And the name was Thomas Lee Dillon. So this high school friend of Dillon's had approached the FBI saying, quote, "I saw the reports about the task force that had been formed to solve the killings, and I just think I got a guy who should be investigated as a possible suspect." This man went on to recall how, when they were younger, himself and Thomas Dillon used to get drunk and then drive around town causing trouble. This trouble included things like starting small fires, shooting at unoccupied vehicles, and just vandalizing things around town. Already a few red flags there. But then the man told investigators a story about Dillon, which was far more troubling. The man said, quote, "I remember we ran into a couple of scraggly dogs one time. They were all diseased. They were sick. Tom said, 'Do you think I ought to kill them?' And I said, 'Well, you'd probably be doing them a favor.' I remember him shooting them. I didn't think too much about it. Wild dogs can be vicious. Then he started shooting dogs, just dogs along the road. I said, 'Tom, shooting a wild dog is one thing, but that dog doesn't look very wild to me.' He said, 'You can't let them damn things be running around.' I let it go by once or twice, but then I said, 'Tom, you gotta quit it, or I won't go out with you. Those are somebody's pets. Somebody loves them.' This informant would go on to say that eventually he kind of just grew up and he stopped hanging around Thomas Dillon. But then, in 1986, only a few years before the murder started, he ran into Dillon again at a gun show. A lot of time had passed, and so this man decided to give Dillon another chance. So they went for a drive together, and it quickly became apparent that Thomas Dillon, well, he hadn't changed one iota. On this drive, Thomas Dillon kept bringing up the concept of serial killers, including probably the most famous one, Ted Bundy. He told his friend, quote, "Do you realize you can go out into the country and find somebody and there are no witnesses? You can shoot them." And as if that wasn't disturbing enough, Thomas Dillon asked his old friend if he thought that he had ever killed someone. Quoting from the friend, Tom said, "Do you think I've ever killed somebody?" The question really caught me off guard. I said, "No, I don't think so." And he said, "That just proves you don't know me very well." Every detail that this informant shared with the FBI pointed squarely at Thomas Dillon as the Ohio Outdoorsman killer. I mean, he matched the FBI's profile perfectly. Dillon had a disturbing criminal history, including vandalism, burglary, and animal torture. He was an avid hunter, he was well-versed in the wilderness, and he also owned an arsenal of weapons. That is exactly what the profile predicted. And it gets even worse, folks, because one of the most chilling revelations about Thomas Dillon was actually some of his own advice that he gave to his friend turned informant. Dillon told his friend that if you're going to go on a killing spree, you ought to make sure to spread the murders across multiple counties. His reasoning for this being it would make it harder to connect them and harder to solve them, which is precisely the situation that the investigators initially found themselves in. This statement, this evil advice that Thomas Dillon gave, turned suspicion into straight up certainty, at least in the eyes of the FBI. And yet, there would be no arrest of Thomas Dillon, let alone an actual conviction, without any hard evidence. So the FBI, they went to work relentlessly digging into every corner of Dillon's life. They set up surveillance, watching his every move, and one of their first steps was to actually investigate Dillon's employer, the Canton Water Department. Upon doing this, it didn't take long for the FBI to make a very chilling discovery. Thomas Dillon had Saturdays off. Again, that was the exact day of the week when most of the murders occurred. But it gets even more unsettling because Thomas Dillon's rare midweek vacation days, the time that he would take off, not very often, well, those days also lined up perfectly with the dates of the other killings. The FBI went to Dillon's employer to try and rule him out, but all this did was further point the finger at him. And then they discovered even more chilling evidence which linked Thomas Dillon to the murders. In the response letter that was sent to Gene Paxton, the killer had brazenly mentioned visiting Jamie Paxton's grave. This revelation led investigators to set up a hidden camera at the cemetery. And for a long time, they had all this footage, but they didn't really have anything to do with it. But now that they had a suspect, well, they began to comb through the footage, and, well, what they ended up capturing was both horrifying and completely undeniable. The FBI found footage showing Thomas Dillon stopping at Jamie's grave on the 1-year anniversary of Jamie Paxton's murder. Add that to the list of circumstantial evidence against Thomas Dillon. And yet, again, that's all they had was circumstantial evidence. They needed more. They needed something forensic, or I don't know. They just needed some hard evidence in order to actually convince a jury that he was guilty and to bring Dillon down. The FBI used cars, trucks, vehicles, and also aircraft to keep Thomas Dillon under surveillance. And while they were doing these stakeouts, they witnessed him multiple times, by the way, shooting at street signs, electrical meters, and other things along the rural Ohio roads. They even witnessed him shooting at animals. Now, any of these acts was an arrestable offense, obviously, but investigators held off. They were hoping to catch Thomas Dillon in the act of something that was much more incriminating, something that would land him in jail for a long time or allow them to convict him for one of the murders. But it was impossible to watch Thomas Dillon 24/7, especially at the beginning of the surveillance period before the evidence had stacked up even more. And thus, in the early fall of 1992, Thomas Dillon went hunting and, unfortunately, the FBI was not around to stop him. Larry Oler took to the woods to try and go get a deer one morning in Tuscarawas County. He parked his car at the edge of the forest, and then he hiked over 100 yards, past the length of a football field into the woods, when all of a sudden, he heard a truck pull in nearby. He watched in horror as this red pickup truck stopped and a man with a rifle got out, pointing it in Oler's directions. He had only seconds to react, and when he heard the first shot ring out, Larry Oler decided to just drop to the ground and play dead. Folks, thank God this worked. It did. The killer was convinced that he had actually hit his target, and so he got back into his truck and he drove off. Larry Oler was completely unharmed, and he was even able to provide the police with a description of the truck. After this incident, the FBI knew that they were running out of time. They felt that pressure before, but now it was just completely confirmed. Thomas Dillon wasn't just a suspect, he was a ticking time bomb, and the FBI were certain that he'd strike again if they left him free. But again, it would be difficult to arrest him. They had plenty of circumstantial evidence, but they lacked that smoking gun that would tie him directly to the murders. Arresting him on a minor charge might buy them a little bit of time, but it also came with a very dangerous gamble. If the FBI couldn't gather solid evidence quickly, Dillon would soon walk free, and their chance to bring him to justice might slip away forever. But hunting season was right around the corner, and the FBI were very worried that Dillon would go out and, do his own sick version of hunting. And so, the FBI eventually decided to make the risky move of arresting Thomas Dillon on a minor weapons charge, and they just hoped that they could find some more hard evidence before he was released from jail on this charge. They started with a good old-fashioned interrogation, hoping that they could convince Thomas Dillon that the evidence was so strong that he might as well just confess. This is a tactic that works on many people, but unfortunately, it failed miserably on Thomas Dillon. He immediately asked for his attorney, and he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. And so next, investigators zeroed in on Dillon's home in Magnolia, Ohio, pouring through his possessions, praying to find any piece of evidence that would link him to the murders. This, unfortunately, also failed very miserably. They didn't find anything, and it was beginning to look like the FBI had hit yet another dead end. Running out of options, they were pretty much left with no other choice but to make another desperate plea to the public. The FBI openly admitted that Thomas Dillon was the prime suspect in the Outdoorsman murders, and they pleaded with anyone who might have information on Dillon to contact them. In particular, they asked for any information about the weapons that Dillon had used. And then, finally, the FBI got a break that would quickly turn into a bombshell. In early December 1992, a man came forward and said that he had bought a rifle from Thomas Dillon earlier that year. The man still had the receipt from the purchase, proving that he had actually acquired the rifle from Dillon, and the FBI seized this gun. They immediately shipped it to their headquarters in Virginia and started running ballistics tests. These tests would prove that this was the very same rifle that had been used to kill Gary Bradley and Claude Hawkins. This was the crucial piece of evidence the FBI had been searching for so long, a direct link between Thomas Dillon and the murders. He'd finally been caught red-handed, and he was indicted for those two murders I just mentioned there, the murder of Gary Bradley and the murder of Claude Hawkins. And then, shortly after that, he was also indicted for the murder of Jamie Paxton. Thomas Dillon would initially plead not guilty, but this would soon change. Before his trial commenced, Thomas Dillon suddenly changed his mind and confessed to all 5 of the murders. He admitted to the press and to the prosecutors that he just had this unexplainable compulsion to kill. It was something that he couldn't and wouldn't control. He also expressed zero regret about the evil actions that he had taken, and only once did he ever show the tiniest bit of remorse, and that's something I'm going to be coming back to in just a moment. Thomas Dillon would go on to strike a deal with the prosecution that if he pled guilty to the murders, he would receive a life sentence without parole, but he would avoid receiving the death penalty. That was something that Thomas Dillon really wanted to avoid, which is ironic, to put it mildly, given what he did to all these innocent people. Ultimately, this deal went forward. He received a life sentence, he was spared the death penalty, and he never really fully received ultimate justice for what he had done. But at the same time, this plea deal did help speed up all of the legal proceedings, and it allowed the victims' families to begin rebuilding and moving on much sooner than if it had dragged out in trial. Thomas Dillon was a monster. He just couldn't contain his urge to kill. And if he hadn't been arrested, there's pretty much zero doubt on anybody's mind that he would have killed again and again until he was finally stopped. He had no respect for his victims, and he felt no guilt after killing them, with the exception of one victim. That was Jamie Paxton. Thomas Dillon was quoted in reference to his murder of Paxton, saying, "I didn't know he was that young. I couldn't see how old he was from a distance. I thought he was 30, 35. I didn't know he was that young. Blew that kid away, you know. He had his whole life ahead of him, and I blew him away. I felt sorry for him." In that quote, Thomas Dillon makes it seem like Jamie Paxton's age was the reason for his remorse. But to be honest with you, I think that there's actually an additional reason that Thomas Dillon expressed guilt for Jamie Paxton's murder. I think that he did this because of the relentless efforts of Jamie's mother. All of the letters that she wrote to Jamie's killer. I talked about that a lot in this video. And she also later made phone calls to Thomas Dillon after he was already behind bars. I think that she got through to him. I think that she was the only person on earth who was able to crack Thomas Dillon's psychopathic mind and force him to confront the remorse that he actually felt deep down inside of him. My heart goes out to her, and of course to her son, Jamie. Please keep them and the rest of the victims in your hearts. And as for Thomas Dillon, I wouldn't worry too much about him, because he would go on to spend the rest of his life behind bars, eventually dying from cancer in 2011. This is going to be one of the most unique stories that you've ever heard. And I say that because it doesn't just have a twist. It actually has 2 different endings. It has a happy ending that should fill you with joy and relief, but it also has an extremely disturbing ending, one that I promise is gonna linger in your mind long after this video ends. So with that said, let's take a virtual trip together right now to the beautiful state of Oregon. Comment if you're from there. I'm inviting you on this trip for free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. And if you're already subscribed, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're from. I'm really trying to get to know my audience a little better. To start this story off, I need to introduce you to a woman named Katie. So when Katie was 21 years old, she went on a camping trip, and on this trip, she met 26-year-old James Kim. What I'm gonna say next is gonna sound really corny and cheesy, but when Katie first saw James, she just knew that someday he was gonna be her husband. Katie was quoted saying, "He," again referring to James, "was the cutest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. We got matching tattoos, and that was pretty much how we met. We were inseparable after that." The couple would go on to marry in the year 1999, and this marriage would eventually lead to the births of their 2 daughters, both Penelope and Sabine. Everything about the Kim family was textbook. I'm telling you, it was perfect. They were happy, And they also had an adventurous side. No, not that type of adventurous. Get your mind out of the gutter. What I mean is that they would literally go on adventures as a family. I'm talking things like road trips, exploring new places. They would go on the types of trips that would create memories so lasting that the kids would be left with a lifetime of nostalgia. Now, James Kim had a very well-established career in the space of technology review. In fact, some of you might even remember seeing him on the TV network Tech TV, which doesn't exist anymore, I believe. He would test products, or he would do these technology reviews. And then after leaving the network, James would go on to get hired as the senior editor for CNET, which is an even more recognizable media company that reviews technology and covers tech news. Again, I'm sure a bunch of you are probably familiar with this site. And again, maybe you even read some of James's stuff at the time. The Kim family also owned 2 retail stores in their home city of San Francisco, and it was actually Katie who kind of oversaw these stores and ran the day-to-day. And yet, despite being so established in San Francisco, the couple had been dreaming about moving the family further north. And they'd been dreaming about this for many years, by the way. The 2 main cities that they had been considering a move to were Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. Katie and James had visited these cities before, but in late November 2006, an opportunity arose to explore them once again, and this time explore them through the eyes of their 2 young daughters, which would of course make the experience all the more special. And thus, the Kims departed on a Thanksgiving road trip that would take them north all the way to Seattle, where they would visit some family, and then south all the way to Portland, where they would visit some friends, before finally concluding at a resort on the Oregon coast near Gold Beach. The family drove up to Seattle, they had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and then the following morning, with their stomachs full of turkey and stuffing, they began retracing their route south on Interstate 5, stopping in Portland, Oregon, which, by the way, is my second favorite Portland behind Portland, Maine. They stopped in Portland, Oregon for the night, and then the next day, November 25th, they were able to kind of kick that post-Thanksgiving food coma for good, and they began the drive south to Gold Beach, Oregon. So like I just mentioned, and honestly, any of you from the West Coast will probably know this, Interstate 5 was the main road that the family had been following for pretty much all of their road trip up until they made the detour to head over to Gold Beach. In fact, it appears that they had traveled so many miles on I-5 that they actually got a little bit too comfortable with that road, and well, they let their guard down. So they leave Portland and they drove for over 3 hours south on I-5, and during this, they casually drove past exit 119, which, by the way, brings drivers in southern Oregon kind of over to the coast. Now, for the family, this seemed like just another mile marker on their journey, just another exit, a small, insignificant moment in a long day of driving. I would be willing to bet that they didn't even really notice when they passed this exit. But what they didn't know was that skipping exit 119 would set off a chain of events, a seemingly innocent decision that would become the first flicker of a firestorm, plunging them into a nightmare darker than they could ever imagine. I want to remind you that this story takes place in the year 2006. And so, when the Kim family missed that exit without even realizing it, they didn't have Google Maps to just reroute them. You know, it's a lot more complicated than that. The only navigational aid that they actually had was a simple paper map. It wasn't like their phone started screaming at them to do a U-turn or whatever. That's not what happened. And so by the time they realized that they had missed their exit, they had traveled nearly an hour further to the south. And conventional wisdom would say that at this point, they should have just taken an alternate route in order to kind of cut over to the coast. But in this specific circumstance, there is a huge problem with that logic. In southwestern Oregon, where the Kim family was, there's basically nothing but forest and wilderness between Interstate 5 and the coast. I'm talking miles and miles and miles of national forest and woods, dense wilderness. This area is incredibly remote. In fact, there's literally a town in this area called Remote, which is kind of funny. These are the things that I discover when I research these stories. And true to its name, this town is so small and isolated that it doesn't even have a post office. And I'm saying this, I'm rambling about this because I'm just trying to illustrate that there's nothing there. There's I-5, there's the coast, and nothing in between. Well, actually, I shouldn't say nothing because there's no towns other than, remote towns, haha. But there are a few roads, you could call them, that cut from I-5 over to the coast. But folks, these are not your typical roads, okay? These roads are unmaintained. They don't have any amenities or services, certainly no gas stations and McDonald's. And they're also seldom traveled by anybody except for the most daring adventurers. These are true wilderness roads. And during the late fall and winter, many of these roads aren't even open to the public. And so when the Kim family reached the northern outskirts of a town called Grants Pass, they found themselves in a major dilemma. In order to cut over to the coast, they had very few good options. They would either need to backtrack up the interstate back to exit 119, or they would need to continue south on the interstate all the way down into Northern California before kind of looping back north up until they reached Gold Beach. Both of these options were incredibly inconvenient and annoying, and the Kims debated which option was slightly less annoying until Katie noticed something else on the map. There it was, the solution to their predicament, a third option. This option was a road that went west from Grants Pass and seemed to be basically a straight shot from there over to the coast. And this route is called Bear Camp Road. The Kims had never heard of this road before. They had no idea that the winding single lane road was not suitable for winter travel. They had no idea that the Klamath Mountains it winds through would be covered in heavy snow over the next few days. They had no idea that almost 12 years ago, to the date by the way, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley had taken this very same road, become stuck, snowbound, and then spent 9 agonizing weeks waiting to be rescued before he finally died of starvation. The Kims had no idea if this road was a viable option. And again, this is 2006, so they couldn't just, Google it from their cell phones. And so what they did instead was pull into a nearby gas station to see if they could try to get some more information. They pulled in, and then James got out of the car to go speak to the attendant. And this is what Katie said about what happened when he returned to the car. Quote, James came back to the car frustrated. He thought that the attendant gave strange directions and that the man was acting like he didn't understand what James was asking. Now, some of you will know this. Oregon is one of only 2 states that doesn't allow motorists to pump their own gas. Like, you have to have somebody else do it for you. And so maybe the attendant that James spoke to was just in a bad mood because of how useless his job was, or maybe he was just confused about what James was asking him in the first place. But yeah, either way, this gas station attendant did not communicate that Bear Camp Road was a dangerous route for anybody to take this time of year. If the attendant had communicated that, then truthfully, I probably wouldn't be making this video right now. For whatever reason, the Kims decided that they were gonna do it. They were gonna take this road. Again, it looked like a straight shot over to the coast, and they just had no idea what was gonna be in store for them next. And so they leave the northern reaches of Grants Pass. They drive west on Bear Camp Road, and for the first few miles, things pretty much seemed normal. It was getting pretty late at night by this point, and so Katie actually fell asleep in the passenger seat, basically thinking that she was going to wake up in a few hours or whatever, just as the family was pulling up to the coast. But instead, Katie would wake up to find her husband navigating their car through the pitch black wilderness on this single lane road with snow dumping down all around the family car. She wakes up and she instantly recognizes that the family were in trouble. And as fate would have it, she was exactly right. The Kims tried to continue on down this road, but as they climbed in elevation, going further and further up into the mountains, the snow got more and more intense. James and Katie were incredibly confused. I mean, they thought they were on the correct route towards the coast, but the weather was becoming so dangerous that they actually decided that at some point along the way, they must have taken a wrong turn. Again, there's no Google Maps to redirect them. They had to kind of just go off of instinct here. And their instinct was telling them that it was time to backtrack. And so James brings the car to a halt, but this road that they were on was so narrow and so slippery, covered in snow, that he was actually unable to turn the car around, so they could head back. And so instead, the only option James had was to just kind of put it in reverse and then inch backwards, backwards down this slick, slippery road, knowing that if he made just one wrong move, one yank of the wheel too far, the family car was going to go tumbling down the drop-off that was on the side of the road. I mean, talk about white-knuckling the steering wheel. This is just a terrible situation. But James was able to reverse down the road far enough until he reached this intersection right here. So you're looking at Google Street View right now. Obviously, this photo was taken many years later, and it looks like a beautiful scene, right? It's totally normal. Just a normal, pretty forest intersection here. But the scary thing about this intersection is that for the Kims, one of these two roads was a road with no return. You see, when the Kims decided to kind of backtrack and turn around, they actually were making the wrong decision. They had been going the right way. And when they reversed down to this intersection, the weather was getting so bad, they knew that if they went to lower elevation, it wouldn't be snowing quite as hard. And so they saw that the road on the right kind of went downhill. They knew that the road on the left went further up because that's where they had came from. And so they ultimately decided to take the right side of this fork. Folks, this would prove to be the second wrong turn that the Kims took on this fateful night. Bear Camp Road was already incredibly remote. Again, if you don't believe me, rewind to that part about the rambling I did about the town of Remote. Anyways, Bear Camp Road is already this super remote road, but the road that the Kims turned onto, the right-hand side of that fork, was even more remote. And it also didn't even lead to the coast, which was their ultimate goal, obviously. Instead of going to the coast, this road that they turned onto was basically only used by loggers, and it just went deeper and deeper into the wilderness before kind of branching off into smaller logging roads in a maze that basically doesn't end. This road was not meant to be traveled on, especially in the winter, and come to think of it, it actually wasn't even supposed to be open. You see, about a month before the Kims made their fateful turn onto this logging road, employees for the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM for short, were dispatched to this very intersection so that they could close the gate on the road that branched off to the right and block anybody from going down it. This would ensure that traffic would stay on Bear Camp Road and continue in the direction of the coast. However, when these employees arrived at the intersection, they determined that there might have still been some people either hunting or recreating further down the logging road at the time. And of course, they didn't want to close the gate and lock them in. And so the employees decided not to lock the gate at that moment. And then, in a decision that can either be attributed to laziness or incompetence, this is the government we're talking about after all, the employees never came back to lock the gate, which they obviously were supposed to do. They just left it wide open, and ultimately, Because the gate was never locked, the Kims would end up driving down this logging road through the snow for 23 lonely miles. Around 2 in the morning, the Kim family finally stopped for the night and they decided that they needed a break. I mean, they were clearly driving themselves deeper and deeper into the wilderness, and so they decided that they would just stop, try to get some sleep inside the car, and then reassess their situation when the sun rose in the morning. Maybe at that point it would be easier to navigate, or maybe, hopefully, other cars would come through once there was daylight. I mean, who's driving around at 2 in the morning? You know, they had some hope. But when the sun rose on November 26th, the Kim situation was looking even more grim than it had been when they parked the car, you know, the night before. They had actually kept the car idling throughout the night because it was freezing cold and they needed to stay warm. And the cost of this was very steep. Their gas tank was nearly empty, you know, just kind of teetering on the edge of running completely dry. And when they looked outside the car, the landscape was completely desolate. There were no tire tracks in the snow other than their own. There were no footprints, and there were basically no signs of human life whatsoever. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed the family whole, leaving them utterly isolated from any other human beings. At this point, the Kims realized that they were trapped in an impossible situation. I mean, they could wait around for rescue, but that meant they would be risking death by starvation or freezing in the cold mountain temperatures. And of course, they could try to escape on their own, but that was an equally perilous choice because they had no idea where they were, and any attempt to drive themselves out could leave them even more lost. And worse still, the treacherous road that they were on was lined with these sheer drop-offs, which were now hidden beneath a ton of snow, by the way. And these were a constant threat, and they were ready to turn, again, a simple driving mistake into a fatal plunge for the family. I'm telling you, every single option that the Kims had at this point carried danger, and their time was running out. Ultimately, the Kims decided to stay put for a second night. And in an effort to kind of pass the time, they actually turned on their car radio. For a brief moment, the familiar voices of, I don't know, Justin Timberlake, Akon, Snow Patrol, you know, the music that was popular in 2006. For a brief moment, these songs provided a flicker of comfort and an escape from the grim reality that the family found themselves in. However, this escape, well, it was instantly shattered when a weather forecast interrupted the music. The announcement was chilling. Another powerful winter storm was barreling straight for the mountains that were now holding the Kims captive. You know, they were already snowbound and stranded, and so hearing this was just about the last thing that they wanted to hear. It was a total gut punch. And it was now clearer than ever that driving themselves out was no longer just risky, it was pretty much impossible. This left the Kims with only one thing to focus on, and that was survival. Every single choice, every single moment that they had now revolved around keeping themselves, and more importantly, their 2 young daughters alive. I mean, how crazy is it that their daughters are with them throughout all of this? It's just terrible. And speaking of terrible and terrifying, well, the Kim family's second night in the woods was nothing short of just that. Terrifying. They're periodically running their car in order to blast the heat and keep themselves warm. And they knew that once their car ran out of gas, it would essentially turn from their lifeline into a frozen tomb. But as if that wasn't enough to worry about, as darkness fell, a new fear emerged from the shadows. Bears. Folks, I'm talking about bears. Through the frosted windows of their car, the family spotted these black shapes kind of moving through the woods. Multiple black bears were kind of prowling around in the wilderness near their car, and trapped inside of their cramped vehicle, the family huddled together knowing that the thin walls of their car, the glass of their windows, were the only thing separating them from the predators that were right outside. Katie was quoted saying, "I remember seeing bears that looked like they were scaling a mountain going straight down a cliff." At one point during this night, Katie was so scared for her daughter's safety that she actually zipped her inside of her sweater in this crude attempt to kind of hide her from the bears that were on the other side of the car window. Katie said, quote, "I knew that bears are scared of loud noises. We were repeatedly honking the horn all night. We were scared to death." Thankfully, the bears didn't get them, and the family survived their second night in the wilderness, cramped into the car. But when they awoke, they were forced to confront an issue that would only grow more and more dangerous as time went on. And that would be hunger. Again, they just spent 2 nights out there. They hardly have any food. I mean, like most families that are traveling with young children, they did have some like snacks for the road trip and stuff, but those were never meant to sustain them for very long. Hot food, real sustenance, and enough of it, well, all those things were absent from the family vehicle. Katie actually began breastfeeding her children, trying to keep them nourished with what little her body was able to provide. However, she wasn't getting the proper nutrition that she needed, and her and James began to worry about how long they would be able to keep the children fed. The only survival resource that was plentiful for the Kim family was, ironically enough, water, which it's great to have enough water. You need it to survive, but in a way, the water in the form of snow was actually the thing that was kind of keeping them trapped in the first place. For 3 excruciating days, the Kim family clung to hope, melting snow for water and rationing every single crumb and every ounce of strength as they waited for a rescue that seemed more and more distant with each passing hour. And eventually, the Kims' second worst fear next to death became true, which was they ran out of gas. Their car sputtered off, and it basically robbed the family of their most important means of survival, which was heat. They were now starving, they were cold, and for James and Katie, the worst part about all of this was having to helplessly watch their children suffer through this situation. And this was almost too much for Katie to take. This next quote is going to be a little graphic, and so maybe skip ahead 10 or 15 seconds if you're concerned about that. Okay, you've been warned. Katie was quoted saying, "I made James promise me that if anything happened to the children and if they died, that he would take his pocket knife and he would slit my wrists and he would lie us all out in the snow together." The Kim situation was going from bad to worse, but James refused to let despair win. He actually hatched an idea to keep the family warm now that they were out of gas, and he quickly got to work removing their car tires in order to make this happen. You probably know where I'm going with this, but if you don't, I'm talking about fire. Fire, folks. Fire provides warmth. Now, everything in the forest was blanketed with snow and soaking wet, and so starting a fire in these conditions would be incredibly difficult. But James reasoned that the rubber from the car tires, which were now useless for driving, obviously, might burn hot enough to create this massive fire. This would provide some much needed warmth for the family, and it could actually double as a signal to rescuers. It would produce a bunch of smoke. Maybe they would get spotted from the sky. Maybe. And I say that because at this point, the Kims didn't even know if rescuers were even searching for them. As the Kims sat there in the freezing cold, barely clinging on to life, they would have had no idea that not only were they being searched for, but their names and their faces were currently being plastered on TVs and newspapers all over the country. On Wednesday, November 29th, the Kims' house sitter back in San Francisco reported them missing because they hadn't returned from their road trip. Police quickly began retracing the Kims' steps and they found out that their last known transaction was at a Denny's in Roseburg, Oregon on the evening of November 25th. Again, that is obviously the night that they got lost. The police also learned that the family had not made it to their reservation in Gold Beach, which meant that something had happened to them between that Denny's and Gold Beach. They got to work searching, and by the way, this search area is incredibly vast. But basically from the start, a lot of searchers and locals in that area had this gut feeling that the Kims might be trapped near the now infamous Bear Camp Road. Again, it wouldn't have been the first time that somebody underestimated this road's treacherous conditions and found themselves in a life or death situation. It's actually happened a couple times. And so search teams quickly honed in on this area, combing it very early in their efforts, which is usually a good thing. They were kind of on the right track, and in a more just situation, they would have found them. But fate would deliver a cruel twist in the search efforts. While Bear Camp Road itself was searched very heavily, this critical logging road that splintered off, the road that the Kims were actually on, well, this road remained completely untouched. And again, this is incredibly frustrating because rescue is actually very, very close, even achingly close, you could say. But at the same time, it was basically just out of reach. As the search dragged on, day after day, the case began to receive more and more media attention. I mean, the fact that James was a well-known figure in the tech space, he had been on TV a little bit, and also just the fact that a beautiful, innocent family had kind of just vanished. Well, these facts just really seemed to resonate with the American public. And of course, as the case received more and more media attention, more and more people stepped up to help as well. Two of the people who stepped up to help were Eric Fuqua and Noah Pugsley, who both worked for Edge Wireless. The two of them did some digging, and they actually discovered that on November 26th, the Kims' cell phone had briefly connected to a cell tower in Glendale, Oregon. It was just a quick ping. It wasn't like they had any real service, but this ping had been logged, and it had actually come from the west of this tower, which was, again, in the direction of Bear Camp Road. The discovery of this ping came on December 2nd, and it further proved that the Kims were likely near this remote road or on one of the many logging roads that intersected it. Folks, I can't stress enough how significant the date December 2nd, 2006 is for this story. Because not only is it the day that these Edge Wireless engineers were able to kind of narrow down the search location, but it's also the day that James Kim made a desperate life or death situation in order to try and save his family. Again, despite the brief cell phone ping that had happened a few days earlier, the Kims had no cell service. Obviously, they would have just called for help if they did, and well, I wouldn't be telling you this story right now. I wish that is what happened, but it's not. James had tried to signal for help by building this fire, but that had also failed. All the fire had done basically was burn the family's tires and other possessions away, including one of their daughter's favorite stuffed animals, which is very sad. For James, the brutal truth was basically undeniable at this point. The only way to save his family was to set out on foot and find help. They had been waiting for so long at this point. Nobody had come. And so James just felt like this was the last thing to do. Now, Katie wasn't really convinced, but she couldn't stop him. And so the couple pored over their maps and they noticed the town of Gallus. They estimated that this town was only 4 miles away, which was a distance that seemed pretty manageable, even in these treacherous winter conditions. And so, clinging on to hope and to determination, James made the agonizing decision to leave his wife and his daughters behind. But before he stepped into the wilderness by himself, He promised Katie that he would return by the evening if he couldn't find rescue. And he meant it when he said that. This was a vow that James intended to keep no matter what the cost. But what James and Katie didn't know was just how deep they had driven themselves into the wilderness, because they were not only 4 miles away from the town of Gallus, they were actually about 16 snowy and treacherous miles away. James Kim never returned to the family car that evening. Katie had no idea what had happened, and so all she could do was just to continue to huddle up with her daughters and just hope and pray that rescue was around the corner. And while it wasn't quite around the corner yet, it was going to be coming soon. 2 more days went by, and then on December 4th, private helicopter pilot John Rasher decided to do a flyover of Bear Camp Road. Now, something I find incredible about this is that John wasn't working for any official rescue effort. Like I said, a lot of private citizens kind of stepped up to try to help find the Kim family. And so John was just using his own time and his own resources to try and help out. He had actually been flying looking for the family the previous day as well. And when he was doing this, he noticed some tire prints in the snow on a particular logging road that branched off from Bear Camp Road. However, when he noticed this, John was running very low on fuel, and so he had to kind of abandon the rest of the search that day, and he resolved to return the very next day to investigate these tires further. And when he did, he continued searching down this logging road until John made a bombshell discovery that would soon be all over news headlines throughout the United States. While following this remote logging road, John noticed a female waving an umbrella from the road below him. He also noticed SOS stamped out in the snow, and John immediately reported this sighting over the radio. He had a good feeling that he had found them, and within minutes, every single search helicopter that heard his radio call was hovering above Katie and her children. Folks, they were found. They were found starving and suffering from various stages of frostbite, but they were found, and they were found alive. When Katie first saw those helicopters, she could only assume that James must have actually made it out to town. Maybe it took him a little longer than he planned, but he had made it, and of course he had sent the helicopters to rescue the rest of his family. And so EMTs were lowered down to the family, and they were scooped back up into the helicopter, and they were brought to the hospital. And by some miracle, none of them were even in critical condition. Of course, they were starving and they were very cold and everything, but they all survived, and they all made a full recovery. And the most incredible part is that they had been in the wilderness, in the cold, surviving for 9 full days. Folks, remember at the beginning of the video, I told you there was 2 different endings to this story. This is the first ending. This is the happy ending, obviously. The resolve that Katie, Penelope, and Sabine showed during this awful, awful situation is just so inspirational. It's one of the most incredible things I've ever heard. Now, when rescuers were first lowered down to assist Katie and the children, they were very confused because they found that James was not with them. And Katie would shortly become very confused as well when she found out that James had not been the one who called in the helicopter. As it would turn out, James didn't make it to town. And while his family was being rescued, James Kim was still out there in the cold, dark wilderness fighting for his life. Once Katie and the children were rescued, the search for James Kim was ramped up to a whole new level. And then, about 2 days after his family had been rescued, James's body was spotted from high above in the air, lying motionless in a creek below. He had walked over 16 miles from the car before he passed away, all in this heroic last-ditch effort to save his family. James had died due to hypothermia, and in a very sad twist of fate, he was actually found only about a mile away from the buildings that make up the Black Bar Resort. Now, this resort was closed for the winter months, but it could have definitely provided James with some much needed shelter and food if he had been able to reach it. It appears that James became turned around while trying to go find his way out and to find help. And he even shedded some of his clothing along the way, which is a classic sign of hypothermia, because why would someone do that in the freezing cold? James basically hiked until his body would no longer carry him forward. He then collapsed in the creek, having given literally everything he had, up to and including his life, in order to save his family. Folks, this is obviously the second ending to our story. The more disturbing, not so happy one. And in the aftermath of this story, there's been a lot of talk about why the entire situation happened in the first place. And of course, who's to blame for it. And I'm not really going to get into that too much. Maybe I'll save that for a future video. And if you have any thoughts, feel free to leave them in the comments. I just really want to say this. James Kim made the ultimate sacrifice for his family. You cannot and will not find a more dedicated and selfless father in existence. Many men will fantasize about putting themselves on the line in order to save their family, but few men will actually be put in a situation where they have to do it. For James, this wasn't just a fantasy, he was actually living it. And without any hesitation, without a second thought, he plunged himself into the unforgiving wilderness to try and save his wife and his children, knowing full well that it might cost him his life. That did not matter to him. The only thing that mattered was that he try and do everything he could to save them, which, regardless of how they ended up in that situation in the first place, it's a very heroic thing. And so please show James some love in the comments. And of course, please do the same for Katie, Penelope, and for Sabine.